You floated the idea of having a para-party instead of this idea of like having just one new party or trying to just win in the Democrats, turn into a Labor Party somehow, or have a new party in which you somehow win over a majority of the population and surge to power, or you get enough of the people and you have a revolution, whatever, however the fuck you imagine it. But instead of that, you kind of float this idea of a para-party in which you run candidates within multiple parties. It's interesting, and I mean, it's something to work with. I've thought about this a lot. Like, wouldn't it be easier to pass legislation if, instead of having the fantasy of just one party somehow forcing everyone into everything, you had at least a conservative party with socialistic leanings where, let's say NDP or whatever other party was able to get them to agree to on the basis of a shared, like, agreement on certain economic legislation or certain things. The neoliberals, as you mentioned, they figured that out. The neoliberals figured out it's not enough to just get the right-wing party. You have to get the other parties to accept some of your ideas so that you have a real ability to actually get that done.
People don't often think about how if you support a particular side in a pluralistic democratic system, your side doesn't just win or lose. What it does also affects the development of the other sides, which respond in various ways to what you're doing. Thatcher, her triumph was to make the Labour Party in the UK the kind of opposition that she likes, right? It wasn't that she became a Labour person, no, but she produced the kind of Labour Party that needs to exist for Thatcherism to be a long-lasting thing, right?
She bragged about it. She said her greatest achievement was Tony Blair.
So the first thing to bear in mind is that I don't argue that the pair party will work. I float it in part to work through all of the problems that come up. It's really to explore the limits of the nation state as a form. I think if you're trying to do politics from within a single nation state, not just within a single party or single side of the political spectrum, there are hard limits that you run up against, even if you achieve a very high level of success.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like, you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here again with Benjamin Studebaker, who I had on for a previous episode on the cope industry and politics to talk about his previous book called The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy. And he just came out with a new book. It's now out by the time that you're going to be listening to this, called Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. And I really see this as a sort of follow-up to your previous book. And it's one that is very useful in illuminating the concept of legitimacy, which is something I've been trying to really emphasize, that, not just people on the left, anyone who's thinking politically really ought to understand. And I think people who don't understand this concept, they expect certain crises to lead to some revolutionary outcome, or they, don't really understand the process of state building, maintaining power. There's certain things that, like, are overlooked by people who aren't studying the political theory. And you're a political theorist in really the finest sense of the word. One of my favorite thinkers in this space right now. And in all honesty, it was very great to read your book early, much before it came out, because I'll be citing it in my book, particularly the part on embedded democracies. But why did you write this? Why did you feel compelled to have people hear the message that you are putting out?
Yeah. So I think that there's a tendency for legitimacy and ideology to be estranged as concepts and for people to think that they only need one and not the other. Right. Raymond Groys back in the 80s, wrote about this question of whether ideology is even a necessary concept, whether we need it. And he defended it and argued that it was, but he had to defend it because many liberals were arguing, what do you need that for? What good is that concept? How does it help? And at the same time, I see many people on the left who take it for granted that ideology is a tractable, useful concept, but are suspicious of the concept of legitimacy. They don't see, why you would need it or how it would help. They don't like the idea that we would even, entertain the notion that something the state could do could be legitimate. It sounds normatively loaded in a way that they don't like. So what I do in this book is I put these two concepts into dialogue with each other. I treat them dialectically as two faces of the same thing. When we talk about legitimacy, we're talking about the possibility that people might really be persuaded by a narrative that's invoked to justify a coercive act, right? And when we talk about ideology, we are talking about the sense in which they might find that ridiculous and might not be at all persuaded or convinced by it. And I think it's more important than ever to take seriously both sides of this, because at this point we have what I call in the book deep pluralism. We have a level of disagreement that I think is unprecedented in human history and previously unsustainable. In earlier times and other kinds of places, if you had this level of disagreement, there would be violence and civil conflict. But if you get to this level of disagreement and people don't think they can achieve anything with violence, civil conflict, revolutionary action, if they think it will just result in them going to prison or having their career ruined or getting killed or having something really awful happen, then when this level of disagreement obtains, people don't do the things that you might typically expect them to do. They don't organize in the ways that you might typically expect them to organize. And the longer they don't do that, the more the disagreement can further develop. And the disagreement can acidify and break down all kinds of other sorts of organizational possibilities that we previously would have taken for granted as open to us, to the point where, if you join, any organization, very quickly these disagreements come in and they start to pit people against each other and they produce organizational breakdown. So in this kind of environment where there's really, really intense disagreement, you're not going to be able to produce a consensus that any particular narrative either is ideological or is valid in terms of legitimation. All narratives, all legitimation stories, we can call something a legitimation story or an ideological narrative. Those are two faces of the same thing, right? Anything can appear as one or the other, and anything will appear as one or the other to different people or to even the same person at different points in life. And this is the thing that I think is really missing in discussions of legitimacy and the literature on legitimacy. This combination of treating legitimacy and ideology together, and then factoring in this deep pluralism, which for me comes from the embeddedness of contemporary democratic states. And when I say embeddedness, I mean these democracies are very old. They've been around for a very long time. And because they've been around for so long, they've developed this mystique. They've outlasted many other kinds of political systems. And so they have this character of seeming natural or immovable or inevitable to people, to the point where the easiest way that you can kick up opposition to somebody in this kind of democracy is to accuse them of being authoritarian, to accuse them of being a communist or a fascist. The reason this language is so prevalent is not because there are communist or fascist threats to liberal democracy, but because there is such an overwhelming agreement that those things would be worse. That's why that language is effective. And it's the only language left that really has any kind of uniting character because of the degree to which the disagreement has permeated everything. So in desperation to produce electoral coalitions, politicians go, you may not agree with me about all kinds of things, but if you don't vote for me, authoritarianism will happen. And they see how long they can get away with that and how long people will believe it and be convinced by it. What I think will happen over time is that the disagreement will penetrate so far, even that becomes less effective.
Yeah, so you mentioned a bunch of different concepts that are all in your book. I think the best thing to do would be to kind of tackle them one by one a little bit, just because for those not as versed in political theory, I think it really comes together when we break down the terms. And I mean, first, this term legitimacy itself, I mean, you know, what does that mean? On the surface, it's pretty obvious in that, legitimacy is just the process by which authority or something is made legitimate. Like, I mean, why are you taken seriously in hip hop as a rapper? What makes you legitimate? I mean, in the past, it was if other established legitimate rappers saw you as legit. What makes people obey an authority? I mean, why do people obey the law, even if they don't like it? Even if the polls are low, sometimes I see leftists or anyone really point this as evidence as that a system's in crisis. They'll say people don't support the government, approval rating is low. And it's like, well, if people act as though they believe in the authority, meaning that they follow the law, they vote in elections, I mean, it still has a certain degree of legitimacy left. You can't say it's in a total crisis. But like legitimate at a deeper level, what legitimacy is more complicated because, as you talk about in your book, there's all these disagreements regarding theories of legitimacy. And one of the videos that I did where I tried to get people to think about this concept was called The Two-Party Cartel and the Simulation of Democracy. And in it, I mentioned that, Trump, when people like liberals say that Trump threatens democracy, they're really saying that Trump threatens the legitimacy of democracy, because at the level of policy, what is he really doing to undermine democracy that hasn't already been done? Packing the courts. I mean, that's a Republican thing. Voter suppression, that's been a thing for a while. Corporatization of politics, that's nothing new, right? It's really his appearance, his sort of, unveiling the screen of civility, the mask of civility, and the noble lie of liberal democratic norms that kind of, have this appearance. And like he tears that apart. And by doing so, I think, he might threaten the legitimacy. I think, though, it's not so obvious. I think he kind of has a contradictory effect on legitimacy, but we'll get into that after. But yeah, like, that was a point I made. But, maybe unpack like what legitimacy is and the kind of disagreements regarding it and where you come at it differently. You alluded to it already in the distinction between legitimacy and ideology. But, what's your nuanced view on legitimacy?
Yeah. Legitimacy comes up in our lives all the time in the sense that we all find ourselves wanting to get other people to do things that they don't immediately always already want to do. So we all have to give people reasons why they should do things or must do things that they don't always already want to do. Legitimacy has a lot to do with just reason giving and persuasion and explaining. But in the state context, of course, it's to do with why you put up with the political order, why you accept it, maybe why you embrace it, but, at minimum, why you put up with and don't do something about the political order. So I break legitimacy up into 4 levels in the book. Perfect legitimacy is a hypothetical condition in which you agree with everything the state does, all its actions, all its appointments. That, of course, is never the situation. No state ever achieves that. Then you've got full legitimacy, where you disagree with some of the decisions, but you endorse the procedures by which the decisions are reached, right? You might not like everyone who's elected, but you endorse the electoral system. You might not like all of the laws, but you endorse the legislative system. You might
That's
not like all of the
crucial to
judges.
elaborate. Like, so
Yeah.
the grounds of legitimacy, I mean, yeah, the different ways legitimacy is established. I mean,
Mhm.
popular sovereignty, that's ours. That's what kind of makes embedded democracies, quite powerful and hard to delegitimize, right?
Yeah. Even if you don't like particular people, if you like the procedures, then you can shuffle through the people. And indeed, this is the easy way of sustaining the legitimacy of the whole system. It's to say every time something goes wrong, that it's some person's fault or some group of people's fault, never the procedures, right? The procedures are good, but the people are bad. And if you just get rid of the people, and thankfully that it will be argued the procedures allow this, aren't you lucky that you live with procedures that allow you to shuffle through people, right? You could just shuffle the hand, redraw the cards, and something better will come of it, right? When you're close to full legitimacy, that position sounds reasonable to people and is widely believed, right? I don't think we're particularly close to full legitimacy right now. I think things have gotten worse than that in terms of, from the state's point of view, right? The level below full is what I call minimal legitimacy. In minimal legitimacy, we have disagreements about the procedures, but we still agree on the regime type, right? So we think we want democracy, but we don't agree about how the democracy is structured. We don't think we have real democracy or pure democracy or the best kind of democracy. We think that there needs to be some kind of process by which democracy is fixed or realized. Some people will talk about democratization. Some people on the right will say that we have a republic rather than a democracy, but they'll say that this republic has been thrown into crisis and needs to be revived or in some way re-given, right? But this is still this idea that the fundamental regime type is fine. It's just the procedures. You just need to change some of the rules and then it will work again, right? And in that situation, you don't have large numbers of people who are advocating for altogether different types of political systems. You have people who want to make some changes. And the thing is, in this situation, people can want very different changes, and the changes people want can conflict. And the most effective way to stop the changes that you don't want will be to accuse those changes of being authoritarian, because you still have the minimal level of legitimacy. Authoritarianism is still excluded. If you label a procedural reform authoritarian, this is a highly effective way of negating it. So in this context, that's what you'll see all the time. People will constantly be arguing that other people's procedural reforms are authoritarian, and they will refuse to take other people's procedural reforms seriously on their own terms as attempts to purify or revive democracy or republicanism, right? Then beneath that, you get liminal legitimacy, where you actually have this possibility of regime change, where there is a lot of people who non-ironically, very seriously, actually meaning it, are advocating for other kinds of political systems in an organized, serious way, together with other people with some actual real possibility of success. I don't think we've come anywhere close to liminal legitimacy, but arguing and talking as if we might be can be a very effective way of trying to bat away procedural reforms that you don't like.
You know, I'm not even sure if we're really even at that level where we are debating reforms. 'Cause I mean, like the Democrats barely proposed anything to really like reform the system. They flirted at most very briefly with the idea of having term limits on the Supreme Court, which, previously they didn't even consider that until the whole Roe v. Wade stuff. Because I remember when Trump was first elected in 2016, they were saying how Trump's going to undermine the courts. He's going to override the courts. And then what he did, he disappointed people who agreed with him. And then the court was ruling against the Democrats and, or like liberal ideas. And now the courts are suddenly kind of put into scrutiny, but not really to the same extent that even in, let's say, Mexico, for example, they're having a whole different procedure where they're like actually going to have the justices elected, which is, a way bigger change than just merely having term limits on the existing ones. But I don't even know if like, are people debating electoral reform like that? Like, we might see it in spaces outside of the mainstream. I see at most maybe some discussions around changing the electoral college, but it's, very unsubstantial, uh, not very substantial because like people aren't proposing solutions. In Canada, it even got to a bigger level, but it kind of disappeared. There was a brief period in Canada where we were considering mixed member proportional representation. And the Liberal Party leader, Justin Trudeau, in 2015 even promised that. And when he was elected, he realized it was not in the Liberal Party's interest to actually introduce that because then they wouldn't win as easily. They would have to make coalitions with the NDP. So they just didn't do that. And like then it kind of disappeared for a little bit. But in America, like I'm not even sure if it's at the level where like even massive reform is a discussion. In fact, I kind of think that part of what Trump's weird effect on democracy is that he delegitimizes its appearance in terms of like doubting the electoral procedures, like by saying the election was rigged. Unlike Al Gore, when Al Gore kind of had a case to be made that the election was rigged against him to a certain extent, at least in Florida, he didn't question it to the extent that Trump questioned the results of 2020 on much less strong grounds. And I think like that's what really made the Democrats terrified is Trump really did question the procedures, but Trump also makes it so that the Democrats can run on something without proposing any reforms. Like we're just not Trump. He's authoritarianism and that's it. Vote for us. Like I see almost like a kind of lack of reforms on the table, partially because of Trump. Like Trump is this authoritarian boogeyman figure that allows the kind of centrists to say, you know, we're not gonna. They adopt a more conservative position. If anything, they say we're going to protect our institutions, protect our democracy, not reform our democracy, protect it.
I think there have been some procedural reforms in the states, though it's harder in the states because of the constitutional order to credibly demand procedural reforms. The bar for reaching a point at which you can credibly demand them is higher. I think if we had a system that was more of a Westminster system, probably the Electoral College stuff would be much more seriously discussed, but it's very difficult to do in this system. I would say the reason that Trump was able to make the argument to his base that the election was stolen is that the Democrats changed the electoral procedures to make it easier to vote from home during COVID, which caused the results to be tabulated over a longer period of time than had historically been the case. That change to the procedures created doubt in the minds of many Republicans about the result because they were not accustomed to it taking that long to tabulate and collect the votes. That is a real procedural reform.
That's true.
Generally,
The in-home voting, voting from home. Yeah, that's
yes.
a good point. That's a
And the
great point.
Democrats legitimated that on the grounds of this is fighting against voter suppression and it's necessary for public health. They made arguments for why the procedural reform was necessary. The Republicans believed that the purpose of those procedural reforms was to cheat. This is a quite serious, procedural problem. But in general, the left and the Democrats have been in denial about the degree to which it is a real problem. If you change the electoral system so that people think that now the rules have been changed to allow for cheating, whether that's true or not, if large numbers of people believe that, it produces legitimation problems, right? It matters not just what we might think of as true, right? We might be convinced that these procedural reforms were fair or do have the effect that the Democrats or the left say that they have of allowing more people to vote. But because of deep pluralism, there will not be agreement on that fact. So once you break the consensus around the electoral procedures by modifying them, you have created a level of disagreement that is now interminable and permanently compromises, at least for the foreseeable future, that system and process, so that every time there is an election, this argument can be rehat and relitigated in various ways. This, I do think, is a serious procedural change that occurred in the states. There are a few other things over the years that have happened, a lot to do with, say, campaign finance reform, McCain-Feingold, Citizens United, and discussion about whether the courts are legitimate, if they're going to empower corporations to act as people and to make these, super PAC donations and so on. Is there a problem with the legitimacy of the courts on that basis? The discussion about abortion, the discussion about states' rights with respect to that. The Trump administration that's coming in has this notion that the administrative state or the bureaucrats are compromising the validity of democratic procedures because they're unelected, right? We don't take that seriously on the left generally. We treat that as just some kind of narrative that they have because they want to do authoritarianism. But eminently to them, from their point of view, they think that this is the thing that causes democracy to be dysfunctional.
They're right.
Unelected people.
But they're right about that, right? Like Woodrow Wilson explicitly introduced the administrative state for the purpose of like bypassing democracy. Like he thought you should have more democracy at the level of electing the leader, like, through primary system, so people feel connected to the leader. But in terms of decision making, they should be more absent from the people. He literally says this before he was president in his papers on the administrative state. It's quite fascinating. He's saying like America should be more like Germany.
Right, right.
Number one.
So isn't this interesting, by the way? When it comes to lawyers and judges, the Republicans are on the side of the experts and the Democrats are not. But when it comes to civil servants and bureaucrats, the Democrats are on the side of the experts and the Republicans are not. It's almost as if, these arguments get made a little bit depending on what you anticipate will help you to win, right? But of course, once people are viewing it in terms of people are just trying to rig the procedures so they get what they want, then it looks like some kind of authoritarianism is motivating the interventions. So it's an extremely contentious process. I think there are other states where it's more obvious that there's procedural contestation going on. Although I think really once you take the administrative state and the bureaucrats seriously as a procedure, then very clearly we're having a quite loud argument about procedures right now in the United States. But say in the UK, where there was the referendum on Brexit, the referendum on Scottish independence, the changes to the party leader selection rules in both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, this question about second chamber reform to the House of Lords, questions about local government and devolution. There's an enormous number of procedural questions in the UK all the time, continuously, and every few years. There are major changes to British institutions that are going on. This is, I think, a very clear case where, because of the referendum mechanism being continuously used, it's very obvious there's a moment where it seems like people make a choice with a referendum. But in the United States, because our procedures work differently, this procedural contestation happens in the background in a way that's less obvious. And because our media is constantly trying to portray everybody who's involved as just being authoritarian, it's hard to discuss it at the level where it actually is.
Yeah, it's like what you're describing is that there's different competing legitimation stories between the two parties. And sometimes I think is like, what legitimation story, you know, how should we demystify these stories in a way that makes sense or helps the prospects for a future, let's say, socialist project? Now, I was really thinking about this a lot when during the Trump era, right? Well, I say Trump era as if it's over. We're having a new Trump era, but in the first Trump era, there was all these books, like this whole industry of airport democracy books about how democracies are dying, and they would only talk about populism and far right figures like Trump. And I think you probably know the one I'm thinking of. It's called "How Democracies Die" by Stephen Levitsky and that other Harvard political scientist. And their whole thing, it was just fascinating to read. It was so annoying. Just the way they would talk about it is they would say, he's just undermining the rules, the rules, the rules. It was very little to do with what the substance of the policy being delivered was. It was all about the rules. And he literally said authoritarian, like it's authoritarianism just when you do things, basically when you get things done. When you try to bypass obstacles to get things done, that's when
If you
there's
change
no
the
democracy.
procedures, right? The
Yes.
people who are holding on to some notion of full legitimacy, which we're
Mhm.
just very far away from now, they'll suggest that any change to the procedures is authoritarian. And very quickly, this is impossible for people to accept, right? Very quickly, we get to a point where we go, come on, the procedures clearly don't work well enough to just
Yeah.
not change them at all and to just follow all of the old norms from 30, 40 years ago. Come on, clearly that's not going to work.
And these political scientists, who wrote that book, How Democracies Die, they were using Hugo Chavez as an example to compare to Trump. And they were saying Chavez undermined democratic procedures by packing the courts so that he could get his reforms done. And I'm thinking, like, why don't you tell them what those reforms were? Lifting people out of poverty? How about that? How about like social programs? Because it's like Chavez was a pretty big success. I mean, it's like the problem is that they paid for all of this with oil money, and by relying on oil money, when the price of oil went down, Maduro, ended up when Maduro. By the time Maduro was in power in 2015, Venezuela's economy is screwed, and to keep in power from all the coups, he just basically bribes the military with money, and the Venezuelan government at this point is kind of like a weird cartel state that is in power because the military is bribed because they're the new ruling class essentially. But the thing is like you're gonna have to undermine certain obstacles to get stuff done. I mean, all of the most progressive presidents in history did that. In my book, I call this the dilemma of authoritarian democratization, which is that even in cases where you want to democratize the system, the reforms needed to do that require something that would probably be called, and was called in its time, authoritarian. Like Lincoln during the Civil War does what? I mean, he like imposes essentially, you know, he imposes a whole agenda on the South. I mean, he suspends even habeas corpus. Like that's way more authoritarian than stuff Trump's done. Or like Roosevelt. Roosevelt threatens to expand the court to like way more members so that, essentially you could pack it. And then they just freak out. So they do his agenda. And he runs a fourth term. Like a lot of the progressive presidents, that's the thing, have done things that look authoritarian. So have also the bad presidents who've done things like neoliberalism, like Reagan or Bush with the Patriot Act, right? Like there's this blanket rejection of authoritarianism, and just to mean like when you impose your will, it's not convincing to people because it's like, well, what are you doing? Right? And
This
I
is the
think like,
state. It makes coercive decisions. It imposes things. That's what it does. The question is, why is it okay insofar as it is, if it ever is?
right. And I wonder to what extent is like Trump kind of delegitimizing those processes a good thing? Because I think the Democrats wasted two chances where they could have poked holes in, they could have delegitimized certain institutions that were objectively obstacles to democracy, like with the court specifically. When they did Citizens United, that was 2010 under Obama, right? That could have been a case to be made to, question the legitimacy of the court. What is the purpose of the court really? They didn't do that. You know, Roe v. Wade, they kind of started questioning it, but barely. I mean, their problem is not the court; it's that it's packed with the bad people. It's not it's not like they didn't look at the foundation of the court. People will still defend the court to this day as a defender of minority rights. And I mean, throughout its history, the court functioned to, if anything, undermine minority rights by making it harder to get rid of slavery and give black rights. And it wasn't until like Lyndon B. Johnson, when he started packing the courts in his favor, where they started to rule. Like I say not until Lyndon Johnson, but in the build up to that, like the civil rights environment, that's when they started ruling to may allow people to ban segregation and stuff. But before that, the court was like not protecting minority rights. I don't know where people get this idea. They just read when they talk about minority rights, that's property owners. It's not, when it was founded, it wasn't supposed to be about like black people, or to the extent it even protected religious minorities is a little bit questionable too. Like, did it really?
And
I don't
there's
know.
still a lot of liberal political that is even necessary for democracy, where if you don't have it, there's something authoritarian about your system, because in their view, tyranny of the majority is an authoritarian possibility, right? So, yeah, and that's, mainstream liberal political theorists, let alone conservatives. You go to a Ivy League campus and you read the debate on, is judicial review democratic? You'll have a lot of people who are conventional liberals who would vote for someone like a Kamala Harris making that argument. So the level of disagreement about what kind of procedures are acceptable or not is incredibly high. And I think often the left has worked from the premise that you can produce a consensus that the system is illegitimate, or that you can produce a confrontation between a society that's united in its rejection of the state and the state, and that this is how political change happens. I think in younger democracies that don't have this embedded quality, where the disagreement hasn't gone as far, it was more possible to imagine that. But in this kind of system, it's now so difficult to get anywhere by making arguments. I think we really cannot expect to produce an agreement by giving people arguments. And this causes some people to go, well, is everyone just unreasonable because they won't listen to an argument? No, there really is material reasons why the disagreement is as deep as it is now. It's not that people are unreasonable. It's that there really has been a breakdown in the shared meanings of terms, and to unpack and dissolve each of those disagreements would require more time than anybody has. So it's not that we're unreasonable. It's that every time we try to have a conversation together, there's so many points of disagreement that pop up organically for material reasons that we don't get anywhere ultimately by having this discussion. And yet at the same time, we all recognize that the disagreement has penetrated so far that if we tried to organize people together to violently impose something, we would get a civil war. There would be too much disagreement for anyone to prevail that way without an enormous amount of violence and death. So we're stuck, right? We can't just have a discussion and get somewhere together, but we also recognize that we're too fragmented and splintered to just, organize an army, an armed insurrection, or organize a general strike or a color revolution or something like that. We would never get enough people together to do it. We know both of these things at the same time. So then what do we do? This is the problem that we're in. And this is why I depict American democracy as this many-headed hydra in a tar pit, just stuck in place. And all the heads are going, I got a solution. Why don't we do this? And that head tries to pull the beast in one direction. And meanwhile, there are other heads going, no, that's authoritarianism. We should do this instead. And they're all pulling the thing in all these different directions. And meanwhile, all these heads are sprouting as talkers and yappers and intellectuals just keep coming up with more narratives and more arguments. And the whole thing is getting heavier and heavier, and it's just getting more and more stuck.
That's what I think is probably one of the most unique aspects of your theory of legitimacy is that, what is kind of happening is a sort of chronic crisis of legitimacy, right? The chronic crisis. And because some people, most liberals look at it as either you have legitimacy or you don't, right? It's like, and just having legitimacy is enough to have the order be stable. But, you recognize that there is a decline of legitimacy, but because it's this chronic incapacitated quality where because it's happening in embedded democracies, and I'd like you to kind of elaborate on that concept of embedded democracies, this crisis of legitimacy, it doesn't produce like serious revolutionary outcomes in the way that it would in a non-embedded democracy or a system with, not much democratic legitimacy to begin with, right? And this chronic crisis, I don't know, I kind of see it as it almost has a stabilizing quality. Like by having a certain chronic legitimacy crisis or a period where everyone thinks that there's polarization, where there's instability, the system kind of stabilizes itself through a marginal level of stability. And I mean, I think one of the most interesting ways to look at that is if you look at the stock market is at its highest whenever there's gridlock, whenever there's a kind of mixed government. I remember whenever, there was a study on this, I forget where exactly, but whenever there's a, like a Republican or Democratic president, but a majority, let's say a Democratic president and majority Congress, majority Senate Republican, that basically means gridlock. That's when the stock market's like, yay, and that's like if you're talking about a bourgeois democracy, a capitalist society. I mean, it shows that what upholds capitalist hegemony most is a kind of incapacitated government, but it's not incapacitated when it comes to upholding their interests. So like the police force, the security agencies, all those undemocratic agencies, they can still like, swat down dissent as normal, but to actually change anything, can't do it. I don't know. It's a weird phenomenon. But yeah, I'd like you to elaborate on embedded democracies. Why is this? I think this is the most important thing for people who are seeking change to understand, especially Marxists. I find Marxists don't understand this very well. They overlook this completely.
Yeah, the superpower of the embedded democracy is the ability to avoid the liminal legitimacy where there's the possibility of violent revolution, color revolution, general strike, right? That's the superpower. The cost of the superpower is that you can't get back to full legitimacy. You can never produce a consensus that the procedures are good, which means that your state capacity is diminished and continues to diminish as the arguments get deeper and deeper. So you get this ability that younger democracies and authoritarian regimes don't have, but it comes at this cost. And the cost is ever increasing because the longer that you go without being able to act, the more various things can fester and various things can potentially happen that you will increasingly be unable to purge the system of. But in terms of what is an embedded democracy, how does it get this capacity? An embedded democracy is a democracy that's been around for a long time. So this length of time that it's been around is important in a couple of senses. So one is that there is no one around with any living memory of an authoritarian regime. If there are people, we're talking about people who have immigrated from other countries, refugees from other countries. It's a very small portion of the total population, right? So you don't have a lot of people who remember being 20 in an authoritarian regime. If you remember being 20 in a different kind of regime, just the fact that you were 20 in that regime gives you reasons to think that maybe that regime was better. The most obvious example of this is in France. There was a movement for bringing the monarchy back in the 19th century, and it lasted up until the point at which all of the people who were 20 when there was a king were dead. And then once those people were dead, the movement for bringing back the monarchy, having some kind of constitutional monarchy, it collapsed because that, as a possibility, dropped out in France because there were no longer people who were nostalgic for a time when there was a king, right? That's one of the major factors that you need. Second, you need either a positive identification with democracy, so that the concept of being a member, being a citizen, has to be in some way tied to endorsing the political system. So in the United States, being American doesn't have any content really beyond an endorsement, implicit, tacit, of a political system that is American. There isn't an American language. There isn't an American, way of life. There isn't a single American church. There is nothing really that unites Americans apart from a kind of constitutional patriotism, citizens of a shared republic, American Revolution, American dream, right? These are the things that Americans potentially share. But when you try to get beyond that and you try to add more content to it, as blood and soil nationalists sometimes try to do, what they find is that there just isn't that much shared content. So it's very difficult to construct a kind of politics which is based on a notion of Americanness, separate and distinct from the politics, right? There are other countries where this works a little differently. In the UK, it's not so much that there's a notion of Britishness being necessarily democratic, right? Britain still has, technically speaking, a constitutional monarchy. But in the UK, the way it works is that the narrative is that other people in other places have tried various kinds of crazy utopian schemes. The British haven't, and that's why their political system has outlasted those, right? The French Revolution, the French Empire, the Bolshevik Revolution, state socialism. The British didn't try those things. Nazi Germany, fascism, they didn't try these things. And therefore, their system has outlasted all of these other bad, inferior systems people have tried because they're impatient and unrealistic and not empirically grounded in reality, right? So this is a different way to come about, which is a little bit more defensive. Yes, the Churchill quote.
Democracy is the worst form of government, but it's the only one we have, or something like that.
Yes, but it's better than all other forms that have been tried, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's the worst form of government except for all others that have been tried, right? That by itself is enough to get you to embeddedness, even if you don't have the positive American identification, right? And then what further accelerates this process is things like the collapse of the Soviet Union. So recent examples of other kinds of states falling apart, especially in big, powerful countries, because, if it's a small country, you can suggest, well, it's a small country. It was overdetermined by, as you were saying in reference to Venezuela, the oil market, or its relationship to other more powerful states. These things don't have the same level of effect on the Imaginarium. But when you have a huge superpower, it has a political system, and that system collapses. This is a fact that's very difficult for people to rationalize away. It simply is the fact that the Soviet Union did not work well enough for it to continue to exist. This is a major fact about our reality, and it shapes the way everybody thinks about politics still to this day. This is an event which occurred in living memory. Anybody who's 40 years old or older was very much conscious and aware of the fact that this happened, as it happened, as an event in their life, right? So a lot of the young kids, the Zoomers who didn't grow up with the Soviet Union having collapsed as a fact, which occurred, are not able to understand how this fact shapes how everybody who's older than them in the society thinks. And so they're cut off in some way from the reality of that fact and the effect that it has on our politics. That's something that I think has played an accelerating role in making democracies become embedded faster. This legacy of the 20th century, the fall of Nazi Germany and then the Soviet Union, has very much shrunk the set of things that people treat as realistic or doable. And that comes from, again, the length, the duration of the regime, right? It's because our democracy was there 100 years ago in some form or fashion. Of course, it's changed a bit, right? And of course, it's always been imperfect. Embeddedness is not a claim about the democracy being good or having good institutions. Indeed, oftentimes, the reason that you become embedded is that you have institutions that are in various ways not super democratic, right? It's because you have these things that people don't like that causes these institutions to survive for long periods of time. The British political system is excellent at diffusing gripes that people have and finding ways to keep narrow elites in control that most people do not like. Sunak, Starmer, these are people that most people in the UK don't like. And yet they're able to lead the parties because the ways that the parties are structured enable the MPs to some degree shape who becomes party leader, even though nominally the members of the party have an opportunity to influence that. They play around with it to try to ensure. And you see this with the games that are played in the Democratic and Republican parties in the primaries too. But in the UK, the level of management is higher than in the States. This is all to say, embeddedness is not praise. When I say a state is embedded, I'm not praising it or saying it is good institutions or better institutions or more democratic institutions. I'm just saying it's old. Because it's old, this mystique has developed. There's no one around who remembers another regime. There's a mystique. And then the collapse of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union has shrunk what people think is possible.
Yeah, I mean, the United States Constitution is the oldest constitution still in effect. I mean, that says a lot. Like, it's not a testament to its how good it is. It's just a testament to its hegemony. And I mean, that's something that's, you know, important to know for combating the system. Is also important to know for building an alternative system that you want to last. Like, sometimes I try to tell some of my Leninist friends, because Leninists hate arguments that are moral about authoritarianism, even if it's true. Like, I think, there's a reason to also just oppose Stalin on principle, because he just, killed a lot of people, a lot of bad things happen. There's that, but they don't like those sort of arguments because for them, they use dialectical materialism in this very weird way to justify that anything that ever happened for a reason. That's kind of what they take dialectical materialism to mean in their application of it. But the argument that I use to them is saying, well, look, if you look at just the way the Soviet state was structured, clearly something was wrong. The fact that all of them collapsed so damn fast. Like, they collapsed like dominoes. It really was. Like, no one expected it either. Kissinger, just a few, what is it, like a decade before, a few decades before? Yeah, a few decades before. And, Kissinger and Nixon thought the USSR and the Soviet bloc were there to stay. Like, there was no use in trying to overthrow it. Like, let's just treat them as our kind of rival and get along. Yeah, well, when it collapsed like dominoes, everyone was shocked. That's why I think Fukuyama is an interesting guy to read in terms of end of history, because he's like your enemy who is important to read, to combat, because he is like making arguments that are actually quite good, and sometimes a lot of the time he's right. That's the thing. He's right about like the weakness of the Soviet systems. Totally was. The weakness of the Soviet systems, they didn't have a basis of legitimacy. Like, embedded democracies can handle crisis because, there's not an alternative people can point to. And also, like, they don't legitimize themselves on the basis of something that, like, it's an outcome-based legitimacy than a procedure. So, like, with the Soviet systems, they kind of legitimized themselves in this really weird way, which was that, they're going towards socialism. It's a dictatorship of the proletariat going towards socialism. And, they just kind of changed that to me living standards. China, by the way, still has this form of legitimacy. So it'll be interesting to see how China plays out. China has done quite well in terms of lifting people out of poverty, but we'll see how they deal with their declining birth rates and, the capitalist crises that happen. I don't know what'll happen.
Their PPP adjusted per capita GDP still hasn't caught the 80s Soviet level. They still have a
Right.
ways to go.
Yeah, they still have a ways to go. But I mean, in terms of where they were before, right? Like,
Yeah.
China has survived in such a way by, creating such a robust middle class and all that. And,
Yeah.
from
My
where they were.
point is just they still have room to grow. For a while, they can still do a lot of growth that's catch-up growth.
True.
They still have catching up to do.
Yeah, I wonder. And I think, the population might be a big struggle to that, but we'll see how they deal with it. The thing is, they definitely have strengths that the embedded democracies don't, which is that they can actually act. The government has teeth. So, when you mentioned Zoomers, so a lot of Zoomers see that about China and they like that. They're like, yeah, they can act, let's be like China. And I can understand that to some extent. I totally understand that appeal. What I think they don't understand is that these sort of arguments, they have a ceiling. They only resonate with people who didn't live in a time where the alternatives existed. So they're able to, because they didn't live under the Soviet Union or know anyone who lived in that time period. They can say like, well, why don't we just like, they kind of can romanticize the alternatives more. And I think China, for a lot of Zoomers, or a lot of people, I would say, not just Zoomers, China is the Soviet Union in their mind. That's the kind of role they play in their imagination. If you look at you had the people like the Hazaldin, the MAGA communists. For them, China and Russia, they kind of like to throw in Russia there too, is sort of this like Soviet alternative. And I can understand the appeal. Like, I mean, they can act. What they don't get though is that, like, with older people who have kind of seen, the cycles of the systems come and go, it doesn't resonate. Or people who immigrated from those systems, it doesn't really work very well. So it's a weird thing where people can develop that. And the other thing with like embedded democracies is that they're so, because that's procedural, right? Their legitimacy is so heavily procedural. If they fuck up, they can say, well, you voted for us. Go vote for the other guy now. They can just keep doing that. And even more, if they could actually act, I think the thing you're pointing to about the weakness of embedded democracies is that, essentially they can't get things done as easy. I think that's more true of America. You do mention in your book that in the UK, there's way more room for change because of the lack of formal constitution and checks and balances. But the British example is interesting because they're like the masters of adaptation to prevent revolution. They really are. Like, they avoided the whole 1844 like revolutions that swept Europe. They somehow avoided that. Like Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli, they're these like clever politicians who hate democracy, but they adopt these reforms that are able to kind of, get people to vote, but without giving them, too much reform. I talk about England a lot in my book because England did not call itself a democracy at all until like 1890. No prime minister referred to England as a democracy. They would not use the word, not even in the way Hamilton or Madison would begrudgingly say, democratic republic. We're not a democracy, but we're a democratic republic. The English didn't even say that. But like, they adopted the same criterion that we would use to call America a democracy, which is like, voting and suffrage. Pretty much, that's like their criterion at the end of the day, people choosing their government. The English had that, but they didn't call themselves a democracy until like, the wave towards full suffrage was unavoidable. And it kind of became a way of like legitimization. But it says something, doesn't it, about our systems? The fact that like the people, the statesmen who have helped kind of create these modern systems did not see themselves as creating democracy, and they only, in the American case, they use the word democratic as an adjective, not as a way to describe the system. So the right-wingers who say we're a republic, not a democracy, I mean, they're right. They're right about that. It doesn't really hold up anymore, because how do they legitimize themselves? We're a democracy.
Yeah, the
So
term has come to mean a lot of additional things that it didn't used to mean, and it's taken on this multiplicity of possible meanings. And their understanding that they could use the term, because the term had been hollowed out to the point at which it can be used to describe an enormous number of different arrangements, shows that strength of adaptation. As much as they, in 1790 would have been opposed to democracy, would have used it as a term of abuse in the UK, by 1890, they're happy to use it because they see the advantage in using it. One thing that has happened in the UK is that it's become more common in the UK for there to be a conflict between the party leader and the parliamentary party. And this is in part because of the ways in which they've tried to preserve the attachment of the party members to the parties. They've recognized the kind of Peter Mayer problem in Europe, which is that party members are losing the attachment to the members-based parties. In the States, people on the left will go, oh, if only we had members-based parties, then we would have, European-style stuff. But, the primary system, it gets in the way of this. But actually, in a lot of these countries, the attachment of the members to the members-based parties is frayed because the social base of the parties has come apart. So one way that they can try to improve attachment is to copy American-style mechanisms and give the party members more say in terms of who the MPs are, who the candidates are, who the party leaders are. And they've been trying to do this in a very metered way because they don't want to lose control of the parties. They view the American parties as too chaotic and too much penetrated by money. and not sufficiently controlled. And yet, as you allow the members to have a say in some things, but not other things, this produces contradictions within the parties, where there are parts of the parties where the members are strong and other parts where the members are weak. And then to take decisions, you need both parts acting in concert. And you saw this in the UK with Liz Truss and Jeremy Corbyn. Both of those leaders were out of step with their parliamentary parties. And so the parliamentary parties had to find ways of getting rid of these leaders that were popular with the party members, but which the parliamentary parties rejected. And in the case of Corbyn, it took many, many years of conspiring and backstabbing and mangling all kinds of stuff internally within the Labour Party to get rid of him. In the case of Liz Truss, their way of doing it was to allow the bond markets to discipline her as prime minister. The interesting difference there is that in the Conservative Party, they let this person become PM so that it could be demonstrated that this kind of thing doesn't work. Whereas in the Labour Party, they backstabbed this person before they could become PM, backstabbed them so heavily in part to prevent them from ever becoming PM. Different strategies were employed. In the Labour Party, the effect of backstabbing Corbyn before he could even reach the point of being a viable candidate was to produce an enormous amount of distrust on the British left of the Labour Party. And it further eroded, ultimately, I think, the attachment of the members to that party. In the Conservative Party, it now looks like just a brute fact that the trust thing doesn't work. It enrages the bond markets. So I think it had a little bit more of a disciplinary function. And yet, nevertheless, the Conservative Party lost a lot of votes at the last election to the Reform Party. A lot of votes. So we'll see if the Conservative Party is able to get them back together, as it typically, historically has done.
I wonder if they'll adopt the British, that is, if they'll adopt the Canadian solution that Canada adopted under Pierre Elliott Trudeau, which is by becoming less democratic, which is what Pierre Trudeau basically just made the parties even more so into Leninist vanguard parties, where the party leader now had the authority to pretty much dismiss members, without like a kind of consensus vote. They could just dismiss members. I mean, that's like, you're talking about, Leninism, authoritarian. Canada's parties work that way. Why do you think it's so hard to remove party leaders? Like, whether it be Justin Trudeau or, even then NDP. Why do you have Jagmeet Singh is still the leader, even though it's very clear he's not winnable as a leader for the NDP? Like, he's just never going to win. There's no way he's electable. Anyone with eyes can see that, even if he's a great guy, never going to win. Why? You can just purge people who disagree with him. It's a really hard situation. It's why, like, in Canada, people are, talking about moving and making another party. There's all kind of talks about this because you'd think that at least we have a party with a history that used to be a socialist party. The NDP used to be the CCF. It could, in theory, be reformed into a more like grassroots workers' party. It could, but it's so hard because the leader can just be like, can deny entry and can dismiss you. I mean, it's really hard. It's why communist parties are so hard to reform too. Like, communist parties, a lot of them, if you look at the ones that are either Trotskyist, Maoist, or Marxist, Leninist, and that kind of principle, they usually have like the same leader for 40 years. They're just always there, and it's because like they can control that. It makes it really damn hard to reform, doesn't it?
Yeah, you either have to create this appearance that you can change the parties from within, or you have to create this possibility of forming more parties. And both of them can can perform the function of making it appear that change is possible when in fact it's not. Both of them can have this function, and people will often want the thing that exists somewhere else, right? If you are in a system that's got PR with half a dozen plus parties, you'll go, if only we could have more stable, more unitary governments that didn't have to make all of these compromises. Every election, we get the same parties winning more or less the same vote shares, and we're locked into the same government over and over again, and nothing ever changes. If only we had something which, gave more centralism to the process. Like in Italy, they tried at one point to do a referendum to centralize the state and make it so that you don't have quite so many parties that are in the coalitions. Maybe
They had
you
a
raise
million
the
prime minister.
threshold. Yeah, because you get all this turnover, but it doesn't actually do anything. And then in these systems, people go, oh, if only we had PR and it was easier to start third parties. Meanwhile, all of these European states that have PR are locked into these coalitions that make it impossible to do anything. People forget that the coalitions that delivered the social democratic reforms that they want existed in the 50s and 60s in an environment where the Americans were dumping enormous amounts of investment on the European countries to encourage them to build those social programs, in an environment where the IMF was giving those countries a free run and access to an enormous amount of credit, which it wasn't giving to other states in the post-colonial
Which
world.
countries are you referring to? I'm guessing like England and France?
Like Germany,
Germany, yeah,
and
Germany.
the
Just like
Netherlands,
I'm not a
Italy.
I'm not so sure about like Sweden and Denmark and Norway. If they got like, I don't think they got aid from the Marshall Plan.
Well, not
Or
the Marshall Plan. I'm talking about the Bretton Woods investment faucet and the
okay,
IMF, which gave loans to the post-war states in Europe on extraordinarily favorable terms that it didn't extend to their former colonies as those states became independent. Like this is, some of the like people talk about the Marshall Plan, and that's one small piece of it. That's the direct transfer state to state. But then you also have the private investment that happened on this wave of Bretton Woods-based trade and exchange, this dollarization of the European economies through Bretton Woods, which smoothed very much the investment process, that very much changed what was possible. I mean, these European states after World War II, they had enormous amounts of debt and they weren't required to pay it off. They were allowed to grow their way out of debt because they were given an enormously generous, very Keynesian kind of IMF treatment, which then in the late 60s and 70s, the IMF revoked, right? The IMF stopped doing that for European states and started imposing the same kinds of terms on them that they impose on other kinds of states. And so from the 70s forward, when the European states are looking for money, they have to play by the same kinds of rules. And so they're increasingly subjected to shock therapy, right? But prior to the 70s, they were getting enormously good deals from the IMF, which was working on the premise that you could get an enormously high growth rate because these states were rebuilding, they were coming out of the war, and they needed to be strong. The belief was that they needed to have strong economies so that they would be bulwarks against the Soviet Union. So there was a desire to make the economy strong, to make the standard of living high, to produce these
especially in
social
Germany,
services. Oh, yeah, especially in West Germany. But
South,
in a
yeah,
lot of these states, right? And then who was in the coalitions? Often it was the Christian Democrats in coalition with the socialists in many of these countries. It
in
was
Italy,
Christian,
yeah.
socialists often working together.
Yeah, I
This is
mean, they
something that,
barely avoided communism. Like, I mean, there's
yeah,
one election where some people still say, I mean, the communists won it. They rigged the election. It was the 58 one, 1958 election.
yeah, yeah. The social democrats and the Christian Democrats work together in a lot of European countries, and this is a kind of coalition that nobody is interested in constructing. At this point, the left in the United States and the Christians they hardly interact.
Yeah.
So, how on earth would you imagine that PR would let you do all of these things? Why would you think that it would do all of it? But people will entertain any kind
Well,
of fantasy about procedural reform because they can't imagine doing something else. So just as we have these people who would like it to be the case that you can have revolution and you can have a general strike and you can have real hard conflict, and they're frustrated that that's not possible. There's also a chunk of people who have these social democratic fantasies about procedural reform, unlocking all kinds of latent capacities. And that's also completely unrealistic. So these two sides have good critiques of each other. They just failed to internalize the critique which applies to them.
I will play devil's advocate to that point. I think it's natural that people will want to change the rules when the rules aren't working for their political interests, right? But I think in the current state of things, it would be better for and more realistic for people on the left to want proportional representation both in Canada and in America. And it's not just because it would help the left win, it's because it would make it harder for the right to win, because it would cripple the right. Because, or not, it wouldn't necessarily cripple the right. But the thing is the right does have differences. Like they really do. In Canada, there's huge differences within the right happening right now. You see the kind of conservative party going in a more post-racial direction because they see that actually a lot of East Asian immigrants vote conservative. They have conservative attitudes. And, this kind of white nationalist stuff is scary. And so you have the kind of soft white nationalists form the People's Party under Maxime Bernier. Now, a lot of those voters who would have voted for Bernier often vote conservative because they're like, okay, well, we want the liberals out. Now, if you had proportional representation, I think you would have a huge fracturing of the right. In the left, there's differences too, but we underestimate the differences on the right. So, like, it might make it a little harder for the right to keep winning. The left could win if it was just better at coalition building, which it's not. That's a huge problem you alluded to, the fact that the left has this, I think more than ever, kind of moralism, a purity fetish against wanting to work with religious groups or people who have left tendencies. We'll get into that in the back room after, the whole right-left distinction. But I do think at least it's possible to advocate. I mean, you can advocate stuff like that much more easily than you can advocate revolution. I'll say that much. Like revolution in this state, in Canada, I don't think it's ever going to happen, first off, because revolution in Canada has no revolutionary tradition. It just doesn't. It's the country of anti-revolution. It's the least revolutionary country ever in some ways. And in the trucker convoy, which was the closest thing we had to like a revolutionary movement, which is really says a lot. I mean, I'll give credit. The Indigenous people of Canada are the only people who really had been a very revolutionary since the kind of labor movement in Saskatchewan, like, the big rail strikes. But that's kind of, that's been dead for a long time. And, the trucker convoy that happened in Canada, a lot of people opposed it. And what's interesting is a lot of people who opposed it weren't even people who are left wing or oppose it for the ideas or the thing. They're like, it's so damn loud. That's like a lot of Canadians don't even support teachers' strikes because they're like, oh, you're being disruptive. In Canada, there is a quietism that is much more culturally deep. It's a lot like England. Whereas in the US, I think the US has way more revolutionary tradition. I just wouldn't want to accelerate those circumstances because I think the right would slaughter the left in any kind of armed conflict anytime soon. I think that's the last thing anyone should hope for, you know. But so there's
I talked
that.
to a guy. I was doing a documentary with Sublation. We were going to the conventions, and I talked to a former member of Congress who thinks that the way to end the crisis in the States is to do PR without campaign finance reform. So you can have a lot of parties that are all bought off by rich people. And then people will think they have more meaningful choices because the parties will be able to aesthetically diversify to a greater degree than they currently can, but it won't ultimately produce anything different. I think Canada is probably the country where you can make the strongest case. If you look at the current way people vote in Canada, it's the easiest country to make a PR argument for. But I think if we look at the countries where there is PR, what do you get ultimately? Like Scholz in Germany, Netanyahu,
Well, at least
Maloney.
they have left parties that are kind of having conflicts. Like there was De Link right now. De Link split into a kind of conservative left and a progressive left divide, which is going on. But like at least those exist. Americans have to debate whether to vote for the Democrats or not, or then they form like these niche micro communist parties that go into the abyss. But I get what you're saying, a testament to your point, though. Like, it's really interesting to look at the reason why Sweden has PR. Sweden and Denmark was actually like a strategy to contain the left because they were looking at the growing Labor Party because they democratized quite late compared to America or England. They saw the growing Labor Party and they saw that the system that existed in England, if the Labor Party was to become more popular, it would be able to get more done and win easier, as opposed to a system where you had, if the left was huge, if you just fractured them. So they actually and this is when I say this is the royalist faction who kind of oversees these reforms that are necessary, inevitable. They create proportional representation because it'll divide the left, right? But so it's like both can be containment strategies to validate your point. I just think right now in the state of the left, it would be in its interest to kind of have PR and campaign finance reform. But I mean, that would be interesting. Imagine you had no campaign finance reform, and you had PR. I mean, it would probably be just as bad.
I think the deep cause for why it's so bad is that we have this enormous amount of global trade, which produces these big economic perverse incentives for states. And I think that we're not going to be able to procedure our way around that. We have to, at some point, do something about the system of global trade at the level of the world. And if we don't do that, then governments ultimately are locked into this competitive dynamic that causes them to push down wages, push down taxes. Some of this comes out of the first book in the discussion of capital mobility, which plays a big role in the chronic crisis of American democracy, the way it's shut. But I think we have to find a way to govern globalized flows to be able to increase the possibility of what can happen. Otherwise, anytime you get a government that tries to do anything that's different or out of step from the governments around it, there's a run on the currency, there's a run on the bonds, there's some kind of economic disruption that produces unemployment or inflation. And then before long, the government is out again.
There's a book that I recently just read that is actually very related to your first book about capital mobility. I just want to get it for a second. It's called Levers of Power: How the 99% Rules and What You Can Do About It. And it also identifies capital mobility as the biggest obstacle to change. Like the fact that capitalists can use this as a way to get governments to do what they want. It's way more powerful than stuff like campaign finance reform. And that's something that's, just as applicable to Canada, if anything more applicable to Canada, because we have a lack of domestic industry. America at least has the agricultural capabilities to produce way more stuff internally, and shift kind of to an isolationist. It could take that approach, it would still cause short-term effects. But like some countries,
Inflation.
like Canada, world would be screwed by capital mobility. And
Yeah, the lesson that I think you really learn from the Biden administration is if there's inflation over 5% for any length of time, and people go to the grocery store and they can't find their favorite pizza, the government's going to get voted out. If you
yeah,
have any kind of major disruption to consumer goods coming into these states at this point, people don't tolerate it. It's the one thing that people like about life in these countries is that they can go
the
to the
one thing we
supermarket
have
and
that's
get what
good.
they want.
Yeah, it's the one thing that actually the systems deliver is that, Marcuse pointed this out, right? Is like it delivers the goods. It does do that, right? So if like the way the system has been able to kind of cope with the fact that wages have been completely stagnant was just by essentially keeping prices low by, outsourcing to the third world. So like the fact that people are really poor and in many ways in terms of real buying power have been getting poorer, over time, that's been totally obfuscated by the fact that, we can buy stuff for cheap. So the slightest bit of inflation, it really hits. You really see it. It's insane. Like in Canada, it's pretty bad too. It's been going down, but it's been going down actually by making people poorer. That's how like both the Liberal and Conservative Party, they kind of are in this agreement that the way to deal with inflation is by raising interest rates, which I mean, all that really translates to, if you take away all the economic euphemisms, is we're gonna basically like shrink the economy and make people poorer, make people so poor that the businesses are gonna say, well, people can't afford our shit, we're gonna lower prices.
Yeah, now we have in the States lower real median family income, real meaning inflation adjusted, than in 2019 with housing costs that are way, way higher. And people wonder why, Harris had a hard time selling the economy as good.
Yeah, I brought up that book because it suggests some very interesting ideas. My complaint about it is that it's very geared towards like changing things. It's about change, less about like political transformation. But it does point out that like if you actually want to get things done, you're better off kind of dividing the elite against each other and picking sides, having one of the elites back you, and disrupting the, corporation or elite faction that's preventing the progress you seek to change, rather than going right to the politician, because the politician will ultimately be most responsive to their investors and to like the people who can most affect the situation in which gets them elected. So if, they're going to want to appease the capitalists, even if they're not even getting money in campaign donations, if like those capitalists can, hold the economy hostage and screw their electoral prospects, they're not going to listen to you. Like they're not going to listen to the voters. They're going to listen to them. And that's why they're always saying like where we want a business, a healthy business environment, a business friendly environment. So even Obama was always trying to reassure business of this, right? And also the bureaucracies, which are so infested by a big business, which, I kind of wonder, I messaged you about this, like, this probably might be the most hot take, and it might get us off track a little bit, but, is Trump actually if he were to actually purge the administrative state, we know that the problem with that is that he's just gonna fill it with loyalists, and we might see that as a problem insofar as, we disagree with the things he wants to implement. But the idea in itself of purging the administrative state, I'm thinking, like, isn't that kinda obviously what you'd wanna do? Like, Bernie Sanders would have to do that if he wanted to get anything done. Obama failed to get a lot of things done partially because of that, the administrative state. So, I mean, maybe Trump sets a precedent here that's actually good for a government that wants to change in the future. Maybe you have to delegitimize those rules because, well, those rules will need to be broken to do anything to help the damn situation.
This is very interesting. I think going through deep pluralism and going through the disagreement, which for structural and material reasons is becoming ever more prevalent in society and within the state itself, is ultimately what we will have to do if we're going to be able to do anything. These attempts to resist the deep, by going to, say, political institutions that require consensus to act, like PR, I think is anachronistic in kind of 20th century. But to go through the disagreement and find ways of making the disagreement work for us or functional for us, to find ways of tracking how the disagreements are developing and finding ways to turn or nudge the disagreements in such a way that they produce outcomes that we'd like to see dialectically is where the interesting stuff is here. And I think that we're talking about Trump and the administrators. I think a lot of people think that there are major issues with different parts of the administrative state. Many people on the left have a problem with the Defense Department, for instance. They view the Defense Department as a major obstacle to what they'd like to do, or the intelligence services as a major obstacle to what they'd like to do. Certainly, you have to be interested in not just your control over elected offices, but also your control over other apparatuses of the state that are relevant to the things that you're looking to do. Now, I don't think that it's necessarily the case that he can just purge them and replace them with loyalists. I think anytime you hire large numbers of people into the state, you end up with a lot of spies. Like, for instance, with what happened to Hezbollah, right? Hezbollah expanded enormously over the last 15 years. And as a consequence of that expansion, its ranks were infiltrated with Mossad spies, right? So this created an enormous number of vulnerabilities, even though on paper, Hezbollah got much stronger in terms of numbers and physical strength. Many, many, many of these members were information leaks. And so the consequence of this is that the Israeli state was able to get incredibly detailed information on the day-to-day lives of all of the Hezbollah operatives and was even able to sell them pagers that were rigged to explode, which they then bought. And they reached a level of information disadvantage where they didn't even realize that they were buying pagers from the Israelis, right? So when you expand rapidly, if you fire a lot of people, there is this possibility that when you hire people, since you have to hire people who have the relevant skills to do the job, that there's a bias in terms of who those people are, right? Who are the kinds of people who have the skills to work in the intelligence services? If that is heavily slanted ideologically in society, it becomes very difficult to hire large numbers of them without, to some degree, incorporating that slant into your intelligence agency. So this is, I think, the biggest problem that the Trump administration is going to face. It's this question of, when you hire people, how do you make sure that the people you're hiring are loyal to you? How do you make sure that they're any better than the people that you're firing? Can you make sure that's the case? And I think what we're seeing in terms of the cabinet positions right now is, on the one hand, you've got people who clearly know how to run a government department. They have experience running these kinds of organizations, but they're not loyal to Trump, and they don't share a lot of his view of what needs to happen. Somebody like Marco Rubio, who's really like Jeb Bush's protege, but is now in at the State Department because the Trump administration thinks it needs to compromise with the establishment in the Senate. So already the Trump administration is signaling its weakness by nominating Marco Rubio to head the State Department. The tiny hands guy with the water bottle, Rubio Robato, the one who goes, let's dispense with this notion that Barack Obama doesn't know what he's doing. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's trying to change this country over and over and over again. That guy, who is a total establishment hack, is brought into the State Department to head it. So there's already a sign there that they aren't confident that they can fill the administration with people that are on their side, that they'll need neocons in the Senate to vote for their picks, and therefore they have to cut deals with those people, right? And then the other side, you got people like Gates, who are obviously not going to get through the confirmation process. But why would they bother with someone like Gates? Why would they try someone who obviously isn't going to get through the confirmation process? Because they have this problem of finding people who can actually both do the work of operating a part of the state, a part of the administrative state, and have the loyalty commitment. The actual set of people in society who tick both of those boxes is incredibly, incredibly small, right? That's why the Heritage Foundation and those think tanks and so on, they worked so hard for years to try to draw up lists of viable, plausible candidates because there's so few of them. On the other side of Rubio, there's somebody like Matt Gaetz who can't get through Senate confirmation. It's obvious he can't get through, right? So there's this very, very small overlap between people who can run a government department and get through a Senate confirmation hearing, right? And people who are loyal to Donald Trump. That overlap is so narrow that organizations like Heritage had to spend all of the last 4 years desperately trying to make a list of potential viable candidates who fit into that overlap. And even after all of that work, they already had to yoink Matt Gaetz. They already had to appoint Marco Rubio. It's going to be very difficult for them to purge the bureaucrats and replace them with loyalists. There just aren't going to be that many people with the right combination of experience, ideology, skills. This is the challenge. And it would be a challenge for Bernie, too. If Bernie were trying to do this, it would be very hard for him to find that overlap.
Yeah, I mean, like, the left does need to think more about how to actually govern a state, which entails, having people to appoint, the actual process of getting things done. This might sound kind of ridiculous to a lot of left wingers, but I always see these lists saying, beginner's leftist guide, texts you should read, and it's like Franz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, or Lenin's State and Revolution. I'm thinking like, well, those are all good and all, like those are good texts, but I mean, you're better off, honestly. You'd learn more from reading The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump. It sounds ridiculous, but I mean, like, you're going to need to find ways to persuade people to do things that you want. I mean, if you're serious about getting involved in politics, right? And that's not just like establishment politics, that's part of it, party building, but also like in activism, people want to act like activism is immune from the laws of power and, interpersonal skills that exist in politics. Those totally exist. In fact, I think activists who don't develop those skills usually fail the most, because they sometimes go. A lot of activist types, I think, are like make weak politicians precisely because they enter that environment with the shared assumption that people already agree. And, not just like Art of the Deal by Trump is saying, I'm not just saying like text like that, but I mean also just practical stuff as to how to, persuade people, how to build simple relationships, alliances. These are all like realpolitik questions that you need to do to get things done. And the most successful leftists were good at these things, in fact. Actually, for me, one of the things that I applaud most about Lenin to me is a very fascinating figure. I'm not a Leninist. I think Leninism is a worldview. As a worldview, I think he kind of made it up on the fly. I mean, that if you look at a lot about the way Leninism was developed, it really was, adapting Marxism in a way that made sense for the Bolshevik and particularly Lenin's political aims. But, as a politician, masterful. I mean, Lenin was a master of power, understood how to build alliances. He understood how to like create narratives, to reframe his opponents. He managed to get Karl Kautsky, who is the Pope of Marxism, like the most established figure, to be like a revered figure, a totally like hated figure. That's insane. Like what he was able to do to his rivals. That's something worth noting. And I feel like, Bernie Sanders, and this is something a lot of people have said, Matt Christman has said this a lot, is that like Bernie Sanders, he had all the appeal, but he didn't have the Machiavellian realpolitik that would be necessary to, one, get elected and get things done. And that really showed in his inability to even attack Clinton that viciously. Like, I remember when he said, "I don't care about your damn emails." I'm like, well, people do. You should have brought that up. That would have been smart. Like Trump appeared as a way more anti-establishment figure in the eyes of a lot of people because he was willing to go those lengths in delegitimizing his opponents. And then Bernie around Biden, it didn't even seem like he was trying to win. He wasn't even attacking him at all. He was saying, "My friend Joe, we have disagreements." And it's like, this is politics. Like liberal politics, it's not like, you don't have hard coups d'etats and assassinations like you do in the Soviet power struggles. But, it's just as vicious in terms of like depicting your enemies and stuff like that. You're not immune to this. So I think like those power building stuff, that's very important. You also want to, I also think like, what are you best off studying in school if you want to make a change in the world? If you kind of lean left, it probably best being a lawyer.
Oof.
Like, I don't know, like the lawyer, I couldn't, I wouldn't have the stomach for it. But like, let's be honest, the legal profession is filled with like right leaning or kind of like establishment centrist leaning type of people, right? It's kind of it is a problem. You're gonna need those types on your side. Same with like in many ways military too. You're gonna need military people on your side, at least a certain amount. And
It's difficult when you have a set of skills that tends to be repugnant or repulsive to the people that you're trying to organize. And yet you seem to need those skills to be able to move forward or make progress. On Lenin, Lenin is someone who was really excellent at understanding his situation and what could be done within it. And that's the thing about Lenin that people should pay attention to. Not the specifics of what he did, but the willingness to adapt to the context. The situation that Lenin was adapting to was a very bad, very limited situation, which necessarily debilitated what could be done to a very great degree. Nonetheless, Lenin adapted to that situation. He didn't insist that it was better or had more opportunity in it than it had. He adapted ruthlessly to that situation, while at the same time maintaining a set of ideals which pointed far beyond that situation. He didn't forget what he was there to do, but he also didn't delude himself about what was possible in the context in which he was operating. And to be able to do both of those things at the same time is very difficult for a person. Most people, if they become pragmatic and realistic, they forget about their higher ideals, right? And they forget about what their ultimate goals are. Other people remember their ultimate goals or higher ideals, but are unable, therefore, to be pragmatic or to grasp the current situation that they're in. To do both of those things at once requires an enormous strength of character in a person. It's very hard to produce people like that at scale.
I think it's the difference between being pragmatic and being a pragmatist. Because it's like if you identify as a pragmatist, that's an ideology, and those types become very ideological and tend to not even be aware that they are ideological because they think being a pragmatist isn't an ideology. I mean, it is once it becomes an identity. That's a set of presuppositions that kind of inform your thinking. Whereas like being pragmatic is a sort of character trait. That's just like adapting adapting practices and ideas in accordance to the situation while still having your goals in mind. I mean, it's like I hate to cite Deng Xiaoping, but like, the seek truth through facts. I really like that quote. I mean, that's actually a Mao quote that he claims was a Mao quote anyway, and he builds off of that. But Mao, who's known for being like this total ideologue, and sometimes he was, but I mean, he was a highly pragmatic figure too. Like, I think the Long March is one of the biggest accomplishments we've probably ever seen in any kind of like any political feat. It's pretty incredible. I mean, he just changes Marxism in a way that was necessary for China. I mean, before they had this like helpless idea where, if you just you need to rely on the industrial proletariat, it's the proletariat, and the proletariat was all in these urban areas, and the urban areas was controlled by the KMT. They would just kept losing, and Mao was like, well, what about the peasants? Let's go to the peasants. No one listened to him, and then when they listened to him, and he was shown to be correct because no one listened to the peasants. I mean, that's not in Marxism. You look at what Marx has to say about peasants. He says they're a sack of potatoes. Like he says that they have no revolutionary potential. Mao is a revisionist, and in a way that was necessary in his time. So when I see people say like anti-revisionism, principles first, I'm like, even the people you guys claim to like were not like that in their situations. Like today, Mao, if he was in America, wouldn't be a Maoist. Lenin wouldn't be a Leninist. It's very silly to like take the ideologies of these figures and just paste them. It's like every situation requires its kind of unique strategy.
Yeah, and to even develop such a strategy, the first thing you have to do is grasp the situation and what's distinctive about it, which is what this book is really ultimately about trying to do. What is weird about the United States? Why is it that in places like the UK, Australia, all of these things that people try that would seem to work in different situations and times and places, why don't they work? What is it that's going on that's different? And that's where this focus on putting together all these different concepts into one schema. They're often treated separately. In different people's imaginariums, they have very, very different roles that they play. But to take them all and put them all together and talk about them all together at once, I think gets it at the distinctive character of this crisis that we face, which is this incredibly polyvalent, deeply pluralistic, super agonistic thing that people are always trying to paper past. And they're always trying to say, oh, but you can just, convince everybody that it's ideology and unite everybody in a confrontation with the state. And we just have to do the hard organizational work. And if we talk to people and we meet them where they are and we, read Lenin, eventually, but this is not where we are now. The 20th century has happened. Certain things have taken place that can't be undone. And we now have to live with them and the legacy of them. This bureaucratic administrative thing has been created that didn't used to exist, and it changes the character of all of this. So, yeah, I love the focus on what is actually going on. Somebody like Fanon is thinking about how do we avoid replicating a state like France where there's a capital city, a metropole that dominates a periphery. Is there a way of avoiding the nation state? And the answer was no, there wasn't a way of avoiding it. That's why in all these post-colonial contexts, they ended up getting the nation state. It was an interesting project, this question of can we avoid the Bonapartist centralized apparatus and skip past that in some way and avoid the mistake of making it, right? Well, but the answer was no, there was a necessity to it. There was. As much as we don't like it, want to get past it, there is a reason it came into being. And that reason historically was not escapable by Fanon or by the Khmer Rouge or by any of these other people who tried in various ways to get past it. And kudos to them for recognizing the problem with that system and trying their best to find a way, but they didn't. So now we're in this context, in these rich, embedded old democracies, right? We have to actually look at this situation and world. We can't wait for people in other parts of the world in other situations to solve the problem.
Yeah, that's a problem for sure. People want to, rely on the third world to kind of solve the problem. And that's, some people say that explicitly, and I at least appreciate third worldist Maoists for being honest that that's what they believe, that, you have the third world will lead the revolution. At least they're honest. And saying that, then, but you have all these kind of left wingers who sometimes tacitly have that as their view. They kind of, their politics boils down to saying, America is built on slavery, genocide, colonialism, blah, 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 bad thing, imperialism. And it's like, but they don't try at all even to kind of have a strategy that would, get the mass on board. It's just, the mass is inherently reactionary. It's inherently privileged. And I kind of think, well, what you're basically telling us here is, like, there's no hope here. That like basically the system just needs to get like invaded by China or something, or like balkanized, or third world struggles will defeat American imperialism, and somehow America won't defeat those third world struggles, and that's the best we can hope for. It's like, you're not listening to Che Guevara there, but I do want to switch this to
Yeah.
the revolutionary tradition
Just
question.
before we move on that, they want to be allies. They don't want to be actors. They can't imagine themselves doing anything. And this is part of the loss of imaginarium that we have here. People can't imagine themselves actually doing anything that's constructive and meaningful. So they'd rather imagine themselves being allies of some orientalized, fetishized external subject that they can piggyback on and feel associated with, precisely because they can't imagine themselves doing anything.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, this vanguard of the global revolution is BRICS, even though India and China hate each other, and Russia and China are kind of quietly falling out too. People don't seem to notice that. And like this Xi Jinping and Putin is a sort of vanguard, but we've already kind of been over this criticism before. I want to bring into the revolutionary tradition question, because in your book you sort of mention you don't cite them specifically, but you make the Hartzian sort of observation that America is unique and that there is kind of this like one political tradition. There's Americanness is like so heavily tied to a kind of capitalist liberal democracy because it was founded as such. It didn't go through many regimes. France has many political traditions. Like it has monarchism, it has constitutional monarchy, republicanism, socialism, fascism. It has a lot of different traditions, right? America has, really more or less has one with a liberal and conservative wing to it. Like Whiggery, I mean, people don't remember that. That never really got popular. That's why they didn't want anyone to vote. So, like, Whiggery didn't even mean anything in America like it did in England. So, you know, the point is like this: the fact that America has a kind of very hegemonic, homogeneous political tradition relative to a lot of countries. This makes it kind of harder to imagine an alternative in a way that maybe in France they could go to Bonapartism or maybe even socialism. There's all these different ways it could go. In America, it's hard to even imagine one. I don't know. Does this lead to the conclusion that, in America, people who want to advance a socialist change of sorts would kind of have to build it around, at least rhetorically or in practice or just rhetorically, around liberal democratic principles?
Well, I think that the possibility of agreeing on what all of that means has gone away. So while there is this, you could think of it as a tradition which would seem in some way to curtail the level of disagreement, what has happened is that inside that tradition, there's been an enormous amount of balkanization, right? On the one hand, Yugoslavia has much less territory than, say, Brazil, right? At the same time, Yugoslavia was balkanized very heavily internally to the point at which it was impossible for it to govern itself. So even though it's smaller, it's more internally divided. And I think this is the character of the American political tradition. Even though it excludes all sorts of things and would seem, therefore, to be more unified, internally, the disagreements have penetrated it very, very deeply. And this is why a lot of the concepts that we think of as, in theory, concepts that unite Americans, commitment to freedom, commitment to equality or fairness, meritocracy, representation. In practice, these concepts have been so thoroughly balkanized, both at the level of theory and just in terms of the way they're understood in society, that increasingly people are not sure what they mean. A lot of the time, if somebody uses a concept like equality or fairness, they'll even preface it with, whatever that means. We've reached a point where everybody knows on some level that we don't agree on what these words mean. And people think that they're going to win an argument. And if a lot of people right now, especially with liberty and freedom, they think, well, equality's become a mess. Because of the equity stuff and the identity politics that occurred in relation to that. Let's just get away from that and go back to freedom or liberty, right? But the reason that so many people moved into the equality discussion was because the freedom and liberty discussion had become such a mess. So you come back into the freedom and liberty discussion, you find, oh, wait a minute, it's still a mess. People don't agree on what that means. And it's incredibly easy to start disagreements about what terms mean. All you need is a little bit of money to start a think tank, and you can pop off an enormous amount of arguments about what these words mean. And people think that because they have the right position, that eventually they're going to get everybody to come around. This is not going through deep pluralism. It's an attempt to resist it.
Well, that's kind of the power of vagaries and the weakness of vagaries. Because I'll say the weakness, words like democracy also, of course, have totally fallen out. I mean, already in your last book, you're talking about how no one really agrees what democracy means. And I think it's why it's not a very powerful slogan. I mean, I was talking with a bunch of people about like a party name, and people about like what would be a good name for a socialist leftist party. And, some people saying Democrat, like let's say a democratic socialism. I'm thinking like I don't think democratic socialism's ever been a great slogan, because democracy has kind of fallen out of favor as like a term that means anything. What do you mean by democracy? Also, like in Canada, there's a new Democrat Party. That's such a hollow term. I much like the old name, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. Like, it had something Canadian to it, at least very specific. And you have democracy. What the hell does that mean? But also the strength of vagaries sometimes. So I'll give an example of vague president, which you talk a lot about also. Is Trump. I mean, Trump has this demagogic appeal where he's able to appeal to all the different factions of the right and kind of unify them by vaguely signaling to all of them. He kind of says a thing here or there for all of them. He'll say something for the libertarians, tax cuts, deregulation. They'll say something for the isolationists, tariffs. They'll say something for the white nationalists. They'll say, America first, mass deportations. He'll even throw in something for the kind of neocons, like having Marco Rubio being anti-Iran, pro-Israel, right? I mean...
Yeah, this is the old Ernesto Laclau populism strategy, right? Which, Ernesto Laclau and Mouffe, they wrote that book back in the 80s. And then everybody tried to use it, and you can win elections with it. But then when you try to do anything, the fact that everybody actually disagrees becomes immediately a huge problem, right? Once you actually try to concretize it, you see this with everybody, right? Like Obama runs on hope and change. And then when he gets in, he tries to do a stimulus package, and he tries to do the ACA. And these are concrete things that are not what everybody wanted when they voted for hope and change. So immediately the coalition is fragmenting and falling apart. And within 2 years, by the time you get to the midterm, you're in trouble. You have a problem. You can't move, right? The same thing for Trump. He does this kind of dance. Then he gets in, and what does he do in 2017? He tries to repeal and replace the ACA, and he tries to do a tax cut, mainly for rich people. These two things are immediately enormously controversial and fail to produce consensus. So you could do this in terms of your language or rhetoric, but if there is actual disagreement that actually exists for material reasons, this is a papering over that works during the campaign but doesn't actually produce state capacity in the long term. What it does do is it puts you in a vulnerable position, because you will then be asked to deliver on these things that you've vaguely gestured at where nobody knows what they mean. And in many cases, even you don't know, right? And that's why Trump at this point goes, I don't know. I have concepts of a plan. I'm not president right now. This is actually the best answer to give from a campaign position, because to give a plan in that situation, no matter what the plan he gave, would have produced even worse effects politically than going, I have concepts of a plan. This is why people don't even do policy anymore, because it's been recognized at this point that coming out with a policy strategy opens you to criticism. But of course, if you were governing, you would propose policy, and then it would be criticized. And this is, I think, the degree to which this stuff has just gone really, really deep. We've, I think, really for about 40 years now, politicians have been doing that Laclau floating signifier thing. You saw Harris do it with freedom at the convention. The word freedom was just plastered all over the place. What does freedom mean? It can mean whatever you want. It can mean reproductive freedom. It can mean freedom for gay marriage. It can mean freedom from slavery and from segregation. It can mean, freedom from having to worry about Trump and having to check your phone in the morning when you wake up. This doesn't work, because in practice, there's this question of what is this person going to do? And this does matter to people at the end of the day. We don't live in a world where the disagreement is just a consequence of language. And this is what the liberal centrists who think that there's nothing fundamentally wrong argue. They argue that ultimately it's all just a consequence of the language. And if we use the language differently or smarter, then you'll be able to get this consensus. And this is what they've been pushing for 40 years now. That Leclerc thing was initially proposed as a strategy for socialists. It was picked up by the Clinton people. It was picked up by the New Democrats. It was picked up by the Republicans. The socialists have been the worst at using it. But it's just a strategy for winning elections. It doesn't actually allow you to do things.
Well, yeah, that's why I think of it as a two-step process. Like, you need to have the strategy of coalition building, of actually building popular support, and then you need to have a plan for what you're going to do when you actually get there. The right has done the first thing very well. It's been able to, have a kind. Well, I mean, the neoliberals actually are a good example of having both. Neoliberals were prepared for years. Like, I mean, they were preparing since the Keynesian consensus, but it wasn't until like the stagflation where they were able to actually kind of have their agendas get implemented. They had concrete plans. It's not the stuff we'd want, neoliberal austerity, but I mean, they had a plan. They're kind of very successful case study of a sort of imposing hegemony.
Yes,
But
but not just because of ideas, but because neoliberalism works with the conditions that were
works
emerging in the
conditions.
70s and
Yeah.
80s. It fits with those conditions in a way that what these other people are trying to do, it doesn't. Neoliberalism is going, okay, we have a bunch of states that are competing in a globalized trade system with highly mobile capital. If you don't play the competitive game, then you're going to lose the competitive game. And the economic consequences of losing the game will cause you to lose power. So therefore, you have to do whatever's necessary to win the game. However, many of the things that are necessary to win the game are politically unpopular in and of themselves because they, in other ways, debilitate the population.
Yeah,
And so
crushing
this is the
labor union.
contradiction at the heart of it, right? But the neoliberal goal is to manage that contradiction as best as they can. And that's, at least in relation to what's going on. What a lot of people on the left and right do is nostalgic or fantasist and doesn't have anything to do with the material reality of the way in which the world is actually structured. So, in trying to make the world better, you have to start with some understanding of the way it is. And this is just what's completely missing. And so this thinking that you can make a consensus by coming to new language about liberty or freedom or democracy, this misses what's really wrong. What's wrong with the left is that the left doesn't grasp the way the globalized international system works. And because it doesn't grasp this, it never organizes in a way which is attempting to overcome that structure. It instead regresses into all of this stuff, which is either just conceptual language play, or it becomes fantasist about resurrecting or returning to previous situations where the changes that have occurred had not yet taken place. It imagines operating in the post-war context, or operating in the period of Vladimir Lenin, or operating in the 1840s, or in the Gilded Age, where there was a different kind of state and a different level of social organization. It doesn't grapple with what is actually going on. And that's what I really want people to do. I want people to grapple with what's actually going on in the country that you live in, where you could do
Yeah,
things. You can do things. You live here. This is where you are.
exactly.
Pay
Look at your
attention
own
to it.
country.
Look
Yeah.
at it.
Well, I
It's right
see.
there. It's out the window. Go and look.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a twofold process in the sense that like what I was alluding to is the right is good at the language and the Trumpian right, but they've kind of failed to deliver on the plan. The left is bad at both right now. And I think we need both. We definitely need like actual plan building. And that's kind of what I was getting at when talking about like what should we prioritize reading. It's better to read about like how your country works. Like if you're in Canada, learn about like the different institutions. Because if for like it's something I've thought about a lot about like like how would you deal with the RCMP, stuff like that, or what are some voids, like some voids to fill. What are ways you could build power where there isn't already a consolidated bureaucracy that would stop you? you know to me, actually, the question is much more tough in America than it is in Canada, and I'll save that for another discussion just because Canada is a niche situation. But let's just say, like, you got to look for the voids, the weak points, the particularities in which you want to build a strategy around in your country and how you would get things done. And that's crucial, but you also definitely need the language is important. I think the language is very important because how else do you get enough people at your side? Let's be honest, most people don't have the time, energy, or intelligence to often think about this stuff, and the main thing is being the time, energy. And a lot of people who might have all those things might not even be wanting to think about this stuff because they're not politicized, or they don't even find the left appealing. And a big thing, let's be honest, that makes the left not appealing is the language. So, like, I think, by having a very off-putting language, which is, if you're a straight white male, you need to go, you should, you gotta pledge an oath of guilt, like, to your settler colonial past, blah, blah, blah. I'm exaggerating here. I'm being a little hyperbolic, but you know what I mean. Like, there's a kind of alienating left politics, a language that prevents a lot of people from getting to the side. And I think the more people you have on your side, who are at least interested, at least open, who don't hate your guts, maybe, like, you'll get people there who will contribute something, who will, you
Mm.
know,
But there are
be thinking
reasons
about
that
this
that
stuff.
has happened, right? There are reasons that this language has become dominant. And that's because there really is a contradiction between the college educated people and the non college educated people. The professional worker, you know, distinction, whether you want to call it a class conflict or a conflict among strata, however you prefer to frame it, I think it is real and it's grounded in this expansion of the university system, which then had the legs cut out from under it because the growth that it was premised on did not materialize, right? So instead of transitioning the whole workforce from being this, blue collar, non college educated workforce to a highly skilled service economy workforce, which is how in the middle to late 20th century they were thinking about that transition and as something which was going to happen. And therefore, if you were progressive, you were just on the side of where it was going demographically, not in terms of racial composition or ethnic composition or cultural, but in terms of the actual what kind of jobs people do and how that subjectivizes them. There was a class progress narrative that we would send eventually almost everyone to college and that this would fundamentally change the character of the politics and the kind of language that's useful. Since the growth didn't materialize, that didn't actually happen. So now we have this half aborted professional class that did
Mm.
not fully come into existence as the new class. And at the same time, we have this kind of shattered, beaten up, bludgeoned old working class, which has not been fully done away with or transitioned. And these two things exist at the same time, and they actually do demand different ways of talking and interacting. And so, like, if Bernie Sanders had gone after Hillary Clinton, and if he had done these things, the unfortunate reality is that the Democratic Party is full of professionals who like Hillary Clinton, and he would have lost a lot of their supporters in the primary in doing that. He would have gained support among independents and Republicans. But I think there was an actual dilemma that was faced running in the Democratic Party
True.
primary, which is that if you poll Democratic primary voters, they like these Democrats generally. They like Harris. They like Clinton. Those people actually like these guys. Like the actual possibility, and it's difficult for us to recognize how weird everything is and how much disagreement there is. There's an enormous number of people who actually like Harris and Hillary Clinton, actually like them. A real serious contingent of the population. It really
Well,
exists. It
Hillary
does.
Kamala Harris dropped out of the race, like, she was the first to drop out of the primary race in 2020, and she didn't
Yes,
even
yes. Harris is a much weaker candidate than Clinton. But Clinton does have her people. There are
she
people
has an
who
appeal.
really, really like her, right? And Harris was a kind of thrown together, tragedy
Older
repeating
white
its
women
farce version of that. But
older
Clinton,
white women love Clinton. That's so true.
a lot of people, like Hillary Clinton. A lot of people like, Elizabeth Warren. A lot of people like, Joe Biden until relatively recently. A lot of people liked him. Remember those memes that they made in the late Obama administration about Biden? He was very well liked by a lot of people. Barack Obama was very well liked by a lot of people. Still is.
Well,
Still.
that's not hard to see. I mean, you have, like, if you're likable as a person, it can make people like politics that they wouldn't otherwise like, at least on a superficial scale. But that's the thing. Politics, as most people experience, is highly superficial. I don't think that's going to change at all. Like, you need to have a plan for what you do in power, but at the level of rhetoric, politics is super highly superficial in the sense that you need like a likable guy, a likable girl, whatever, to like be at the face of the movement, even if they're not actually making the decisions.
Yeah.
Because people
I don't
will
think
like
there's
have
going to be
like,
the movement. This is where I think the difference is.
ah,
I don't think there's going to be the movement. There's going to be a lot of different things that are operating in different parts of the system that are optimized for different constituencies, and they will conflict with each other, but in ways which may potentially be generative. I think that's what we can maybe have now. But having like the movement where people
yeah,
are
I
united
think that's
together,
a
this is
figure of
always
speech.
done on the basis of a number of misdirections which eventually come home to roost. I think that's the kind of the lesson of the Laclau strategy, is that the unity that you achieve through it is temporary and fleeting and will eventually produce disenchantment and frustration, which will cause the entire discussion to degrade in various ways.
Right. Well, I mean, that's existed in a lot of movements, revolutionary movements in history, or not even revolutionary movements. Like, no, the Russian Revolution. There's all these different parties, right? There's the SRs, there's the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks, don't even have a shot at getting power until the SRs screw up.
Oh,
And
yeah. There's always been a certain amount of this, but it's significantly worse in the embedded democracies. This problem, and we have to get to a point where it's not a problem. We have to get to a point where we go, thank God it's this way because it allows the right thing to happen. We have to get to a point where we're able to see the potentiality in it instead of just viewing it as an obstacle to what we want to do. Because when we're viewing it as an obstacle, we are not embracing the situation that we're in. We're still holding on to a different context. And we're going, our context has changed in ways that stop us from doing what we want to do. Right. For me, we have to get to a point, and it's difficult because this does seem like a very bad situation in all kinds of ways. And it is objectively to us a bad situation in all kinds of ways. Nonetheless, we have to find a way to see where the potential is in it. And I think it's got to be through the disagreement. And this is a big part of just, what I exist in the discourse to do, is to just point out, like, no, there's not going to be a unifying. No one's going to cut through this discussion and bring everyone together. That will never happen in these countries. It will not occur. What is more likely to happen is that there will be conflicts that will cause a breakdown that will produce a vacuum of some kind. That something like that could happen. There could be serious state capacity problems which cause the state to just run out of ability to solve basic problems and tasks. Something like that could happen, and that could open up lacunas in different areas. And then there might be opportunities to do things in those lacunas. But if somebody's imagining that what they do is going to produce unity in this context, that's where I think the 20th century mentality is still operating. And I'm trying to, because there is this 20th century desire to think in terms of unified masses that we're just not ultimately able in this situation, in these kinds of places, to do. And this feeling that we have to do that, I think it's a block.
don't you think we have the opposite thing going on though? With like left discourse, the one that's pervaded academia, it's all about against narratives, against grand narratives. It's all about intersectionality, about class, race, gender, sexuality, et cetera, and that like these are irreconcilable different groups with their different interests, and you just have to kind of recognize each separate struggle. And it's like they're true at the material level, perhaps, right? But it's like at the level of politics, I mean, you do need a kind of way to not necessarily unify everybody, but you need to kind of like build a strong enough coalition for something to happen. I mean, that's what Trump did, right? Whether you actually have a plan
That's what
after,
they think they're
that's the
doing with
other.
the identity politics. They think that the identity politics is the unifying thing. Like if you go back into Iris, Marion Young, the groups are meant to be unified by their mutual respect, right? And then to say that it only goes so far as these identity groups is to deny the degree to which this is pervasive, right? All of the demographic groups that they claim are unified in some way are actually full of internal divisions and
Exactly.
balkanizations that they deny and don't recognize. It actually
True.
goes way, way deeper than their attempts to qualify it with these, racialized narratives that are, just blatantly
You
very
know what I mean? It
racist.
has
Let's
a
be clear.
fragmentary effect. It has a fragmentary effect where like instead of
Yes, but
taking on
the
class
truth is
lines,
is more fragmented than that. it's more fragmented than that in more fundamental ways, right? The actual reality is that within each of these groups, there are actual real divisions that have cropped up. And that's why when the Democrats use this language of Hispanic voters go, I don't feel like I necessarily have something in common with somebody just on the basis of our ancestors came from Latin America. No, actually, there are substantive differences between me and other people whose ancestors come from the same place. Thank you very much. We have this incredibly pluralistic society that has an enormous number of different economic roles. And these roles and the people who occupy these different spaces, they almost don't interact with each other. People who go to college almost never socialize with people who don't, and vice versa at this point. People's social lives are very much structured by work and by the corporate environment, and they have very little interaction with people who don't work in the same kinds of roles that they work in. Even leaving aside social media, the internet, and bubble effects and that kind of stuff, just the actual, like, how does a person live in a contemporary American city? People are very much able to shape who they interact with, and they're able to surround themselves with people from similar kinds of backgrounds who work in similar fields with similar kinds of education. Yeah. So in practice, there is really a problem of people talking to each other. There has been a desocializing that has taken place, and COVID accelerated this and made it more visible and easier for us to talk about. But it's a consequence of the neoliberal shifts. It's a consequence of sending 40% of the population to college and withholding that from the rest. You produce these different worlds. The administrative mentality, which comes out of the degree, you worked hard, you did what you were told, you get the degree, it entitles you to something, you do or don't get it, right? Versus the small business mentality of I hustle, I grind, I figure it out. No matter what the rules are, I find ways to bend them or work around them, and I make something which works and is functional, right? These are totally different narratives. Do what you're told and you will get rewarded. Break the rules, do weird stuff, and make it work on your own terms. These produce very different modes of thinking about how we should structure anything or what kind of language we should use. Do we need rules for governing how we talk to each other that are based on we're in a corporate environment and we have a human resources department that we go to when our feelings are hurt? Or do we live in a much more ad hoc, open kind of space where we have to police our own boundaries interpersonally in between each other? And if somebody goes to somebody and tries to impose rules, that person is a tattletale. These are totally different ways of thinking through what a disagreement means or how you deal with a disagreement in your day-to-day life. This stuff is I think, very material and real and comes out of the way in which our form of capitalism has developed. But like the stuff that goes on at the level of politics, where it's just talked about in terms of racial groups, this is professionals who don't actually understand how it works, misrecognizing it and misdiagnosing it in various oversimplified, racist, and stupid ways that have nothing to do with the reality of where the disagreement really comes from. It comes from some people are going to college and they're working in corporations with HR departments, and this is a huge part of their life. They are communicating over email, a huge part of their life. And then you have other people who are engaged in other kinds of work that are more traditional and involve more ad hoc social interaction that is less managed and is less structured.
And also the urban and rural divide, which goes right in hand with that education divide. But okay, so the way I see what you're getting at is like a very Hegelian approach, which is that, we should be thinking through the contradictions. We should go through the contradictions, not try to like act like they don't exist. To which I would fully agree. However, I think politics in its essence has more in common with religion than it does with science or philosophy. And thinking through contradictions is in science and philosophy. The vast majority of the people don't have time, energy to do that. Politics has in common with religion in the sense that it's a mass endeavor, and the mass naturally, right? First of all, to even have a category of the mass is a homogenizing label but like the idea of getting a lot of people together, which have massive differences, entails a reduction of complexity. And,
I don't think that's
I
what
like that.
politics is anymore. I don't think it is that anymore. It used to be that, but that's no longer what actually takes place.
well, it's like administrative conflicts, but I think you know what I'm getting at. Like I mean politics with a capital P in a Badiouian sense, which is like a contestation over actual visions, not just pure administration.
Yeah, we don't
Like a
have that
political move.
anymore. That's
No, yeah,
gone.
I agree with
Even
you. We're
that,
still in
like, it's
Fukuyama's world.
gone.
We're in Fukuyama's world still. I
And it's
was
not coming back either. It's not going to come back. It's going to become something else. It has to
I don't
become something
I don't know.
else.
Actually, I see it is coming back, but from the right, not on the left. So
But the
now
right
that,
is completely fractured. As you said, if you installed PR, you would
of
reveal all
course.
of these fractures that they've papered over.
Well, that's what I mean. In reality, there's always differences, but that's precisely ideology. You know, Zizek at one point even defines ideology's purpose is to
Yes, this
obfuscate
is what's
contradiction.
wrong with Zizek. Zizek thinks that you can unite people, and this is his mistake. This is my disagreement with Zizek at my core. I think that Zizek is still operating in a 20th century framework where you can bring people together. And this uniting, of course, it papers over to some degree differences that exist, but nonetheless, it's functional. I'm going, no, it's not functional anymore. It's not even that at this point. Yes, of course. Even in the 20th century, they would acknowledge, yes, you're papering over some differences, but you get unity out of it.
Well,
That
it's
used to be true,
the idea is a
but we don't actually
contradiction
get
in
the
unity.
unity out of it.
Well, their idea is a contradictory unity, which is that it's inherently contradictory. And I mean, you know, even the way, for example, like Gramsci would describe the way the ruling class unifies, it's a contradictory unity, right? Like there's all these competing interests, often diametrically at odds. And in that sense, there's no real bourgeois capitalist state in the sense that, you know, they're not actually unified. The bourgeoisie is not a homogenous thing, but there is a contradictory unity that is facilitated by
No,
the
no,
state that is
flip
temporary.
it, put it the other way around. It's a unitary contradiction,
What
right?
you
The
mean?
whole world is a unitary, is a unus, right? The whole world is a unus, but in the way it's instantiated, it's continuously in contradiction, right? It's not that there is a union that is being obscured with an appearance of contradiction. It's that there is a ton of contradiction that comes out of the way in which we come into being in this kind of world. In this kind of world where you have a bunch of different nation states, and these different nation states have a bunch of different sectoral interests, class interests, right? Ultimately, you're going to have an enormous amount of disagreement when that is going on materially. And the thing that has happened over the lifespan of capitalism is that what appeared to exist at the start of the discussion, a Rousseauian people, which has a unitary quality, has fractured repeatedly in ways each time it fractures, it becomes harder and harder to ever put the pieces back together again as we get ever further removed from that moment where it looked as if that image was appropriate. I think we really have reached a stage where this level of fracturing is something that will have to work itself out.
I guess, well, like, I mean, to what extent it was already the people, it was always a myth in the sense that it's there to kind of, you know, unify differences. It doesn't actually unify them in reality. That's what I'm trying to make the distinction here between the form and content. I think
Yeah,
he was,
but it doesn't even functionally unify. It
it
doesn't even
doesn't even,
unify to the
what you're saying,
degree
it
at
doesn't
which
work.
they suggested. It doesn't work.
Yeah, so what you're saying is even the attempt to kind of paper over contradictions, even though if they still exist, is impossible, and that we should work through deep pluralism. What does working through deep pluralism look like?
So I think what it looks like is to map out the different positions that exist and to see how their interaction can develop across time. Right? So by the time I get to the end of the book, I have kind of turned it into 4 different moods that people can be in, right? A conservative mood, which is about defending or holding on to existing legitimation stories or ideological narratives. A liberal mood, which wants to change or reshape those things, but within the framework of liberal legitimating abstractions, within the kind of liberal framework. So they want different understandings of liberty, equality, equity, representation, right? A negative mood, which is seeing the sense in which all of this is ideological and can never return to a world of not having seen that, right? And is in this position of thinking that the whole thing doesn't work and needs in some way to be replaced or overcome, but is not yet sure with what, right? And then this enclavist tendency where people instead start looking for ways in their private lives to realize values that they've recognized are not going to be politically realized. And I think that people can be in any one of those four moods. And I think people move around throughout their lives. And that also at any given time in our society, there are people in all four of those moods around us all the time. And we will never put them together into one mood. Right? So anyone whose politics is predicated on getting everybody into one of the moods at once is, I think, just not operating in reality.
I don't think
And
anyone really believes they can do that. Like, seriously, I think what more people envision who have that idea would be more to like build a political group that is big enough to build coalitions
yeah, I
with
don't mean
other groups.
literally everyone. I just mean you can't even do that. It's not even possible to do this coalition building thing anymore. This is just not going to work. We are seeing this in the states that have proportional representation, have these dysfunctional coalitions that can't govern, can't do reform, can't do real change, right? This is going on everywhere in the world that where people are trying to do this kind of thing in these embedded old-fashioned democracies, right? This is, I think, really the thing that has changed is that the level of disagreement is just much greater than has generally been grasped and has made a bunch of stuff impossible that used to appear in the 20th century to be worked. I really do think this is true. And I could be wrong, but this is something that is, I think, distinctive about my view, right? Really, the disagreements are grounded in something that happened, which is this post-war boom was aborted. And in this aborting of the post-war boom, you got this separation into professionals and workers. And then as the Soviet Union fell away, it seemed as if there was no way politically of responding to the problems that were thrown up by this. And the different parts all want to respond to it differently. The workers, the small business owners, and the people who go to college, they have completely different notions of what's wrong. They don't share an understanding of the problem. They can't be brought together. And so like even Trump, he wins, what has been described as this huge electoral victory. He gets 53% of the vote, maybe 52, 53. Is it even that? What percentage did he get? It's not very high, ultimately, right? He gets 53 senators. I think it was a lower percentage. I think it was 50% and 53 senators, right? And this is not a functioning governing coalition to the point where if you have 5 senators who are neocons, they can kill anybody he appoints, right? So the right has not achieved an electoral victory which actually allows them to do very much at all. Even though this is by our standards today.
They have all 3 houses, and even if it's not unified in the faction, the whole purpose of the American system is to like quote unquote balance the factions, right? But you have like a wing of that side that is very much like more hegemonic than it was before in terms of controlling branches of government. Within there, that you're going to have those differences which do exist, but like the way I see that is like either you work within those differences and have some coalition, or else you have to take the Leninist approach, which is ban factions, which taken to its logical conclusion ends up being Stalin, which you kind of try to block out all the factions from not just the other parties but within your own party, right? Where you start
right, but you can get to an objective condition of ungovernability. You can get to a point where objectively the kinds of factions that exist
Sure.
make it such that you can't govern.
Absolutely.
And I think that is what we're getting. We're reaching a stage where deep pluralism is producing a crisis of permanent ungovernability.
But isn't that good for the ruling class, who wouldn't want stuff to change too much?
It's contradictory for them, right? On the one hand, it does frustrate major changes that might be inconvenient, right? On the other hand, it debilitates state capacity to the point at which the state can't perform functions they may need it to perform. And this is going on at the same time. And at this point, you have state capacity libertarians who argue that state capacity is necessary and that ultimately to preserve freedom, libertarian freedom, you need state capacity. People have reached a stage of making that argument in response to this. Libertarians, right?
Well,
libertarians.
Are you referring to like basically Project 2025 and the Heritage? Because they
No, I'm not talking about Heritage. I'm talking about like the state capacity libertarians. People like what's his name?
Curtis Yarvin?
No, not Curtis Yarvin. He's a like Tyler Cowen.
Yes, I have seen there is a libertarian to quote unquote authoritarian pipeline in which they realize that to realize their goals they want for a capitalist
No,
system,
no,
they
but these
need
aren't
a state.
authoritarians. These are sincere libertarians who think that there's a state capacity problem that is getting in the way of individual freedom. And they're not authoritarian. They're not, in the kind of Jason Brennan, Kaplan kind of camp. They're not neo-reactionary. These are people who think that in some way you have to revitalize the compound republic, right?
Elaborate on that.
Yeah, so they're like Brandon Christensen, some of these guys, out in, yeah, there's a huge chunk of libertarians who sincerely think that there's a governability crisis as libertarians without becoming authoritarian figures. There's a big chunk of these people. Like, part of what's going on is that there's so many disagreements in so many parts of the spectrum, and it's so difficult for anybody to keep track of all of it. You have to do this full time and spend all your time trying to keep track of it, even to know what all the positions are. It's become incredibly, incredibly convoluted, to the point where, like, I'm finding all the time that when I talk to other people who do this full time, there's all sorts of groups and factions that people are not paying attention to, and that even I, don't pay attention to and miss. I who spend all my time trying to figure this out. I'll hear about something from somebody and go, wait, that exists? Those people exist? Where are they? What are they up to? Oh my God, there's actually more of them than I thought. But there's so much of this going on. It's incredibly hard for any one person to keep track of all of this all at once. And this is the character of it that's so difficult. You go back to the 19th century, the early 20th century, you could discuss the class structure in a way that would seem plausible to a large number of people, right? Plausible. At this point, any attempt to describe what exists is extremely controversial, right? And this is the trouble, right? Like, even in this conversation, there are different notions of what exists. And of course, this is an argument I could potentially make in almost any situation where I'm in a disagreement. So, there's a certain qualification on it. But I do think that when we start to really drill into the details of anything, we're just finding an incredibly intractable amount of disagreement. Like, I hang out with people who think of themselves as socialists and don't want universal health care. And I hang out with people who, have incredibly, like, Christian positions, but also they're committed, Republicans who like, Cicero. There are incredibly weird and strange things that are going on in American political culture and in every part of the spectrum at this point, and weird mutations and interminglings of things. And yes, some of this is online, but more and more people are spending more and more time online. The digital subject is a major part of the picture here, too. And so people are finding stuff that is different and is unusual. And they think things are realistic or possible now because they've encountered it. But the thing is, while we can find more people than we would ever expect who believe any given thing, we cannot actually build a 20th century style movement around any of those positions. And that is, I think, a fundamental change.
I want to ask how you think we could possibly go through this black pill. How people should internalize what is this black pill? Because in the book, you go over 4 different kind of ways people cope with this, as kind of sort of building on your previous book about the 4 copes of sorts. But before you say that, I do want to say, like, part of where the disagreement might emerge is, I think you remind me a lot of Adorno. And Adorno is, I think, not just Adorno, but like Adorno is especially, he embodies the philosopher's dilemma, which is, you can get into this is why, Weber said philosophers make bad politicians and politicians make bad philosophers, is you can get into the abyss of complexity. Complexity, when digging deep and discovering complexity, can be elucidating. Too much complexity can also be crippling, in the sense that, it's overwhelming. It's a lot to deal with. You don't know how to make sense of anything. And I think, actually, part of the way we've counteracted that, it's in Adorno's own analysis, when he says myth was already enlightenment. What he gets at with that is that myth was how humans before Enlightenment ideology, found a way to have dominance over nature, to kind of overcome natural hurdles of life. By adopting myths, humans convince themselves that they are way more powerful than they actually were. That there was an order to things, that they understood things. I mean, it's delusions, but it's in many ways helped humans overcome all sort of things and overcome struggles. Like myth is extremely powerful in doing that. And like, it's why I don't really see a full escape from ideology, because ideology is kind of like at a macro, at an individual level, what myth is. I think the difference is that myth has a master signifier involved in ideology, and it's also what kind of shares people, brings people of ideologies together in a really contradictory sort of unifying process. Highly contradictory unifying process. And I know you're thinking of probably Sorel right now. Yes, Sorel did touch on this. This is what's interesting about Sorel. Sorel, I think, was right about a rational kernel. There's a big rational kernel of truth in Sorel's analysis, which is that he says, class conflict. No one really is that passionate about that, except lofty intellectuals. Even workers who might identify as workers, they're not going to go die for the international proletariat. That's a myth. People go die for individual causes, or a pledge to like something kind of almost a bit larger than life, larger than themselves, not just for their material interest. His irrationalism, as some people like to criticize it, his irrationalism speaks to the fundamental irrationality in human behavior that is involved in all political actions, right? And the reason why I think that sort of thinking has kind of been tarnished, and why I think haven't dealt with the reality of that thinking, is because the only guy to listen to what Sorel was saying happened to be Mussolini. Mussolini was like, took a page out of his book, said, you know what motivates people more than class? The nation. That's the thing. You can disagree. You can think Mussolini's politics are terrible. Was Mussolini right in the nation being way more of a motivating, unifying, politically successful signifier of sorts, myth, than class? Absolutely. Even the communist countries all adopted nationalism, all of them, every single one of them. In their revolutions, the ones that came to power, their movements, and even the ones who didn't originally, like the Bolsheviks, which came to power by a single issue, which was the war, pretty much, Kerensky government failing. They ended up adopting nationalism later when they figured out people weren't going to war for them. They wanted to mobilize people for the war effort. Stalin, he brings back all the Russian nationalism, and that kind of stayed in the kind of consciousness, like even after that, right? So like they all end up
I
appealing
do think that stuff used to work. I do think it used to work. In the 1920s, in the 1930s, in the 20th century, in young democracies, in non-democratic states. I think a lot more of that stuff used to work. Even 20 or 30 years ago, that stuff worked better or was more plausible. But my intervention was really to say that stuff doesn't work anymore, not in these places. Not in
What
this
you say
kind of
about
place.
West Europe now, though, the rise of nationalism everywhere, like especially, let's look at France, where nationalism's on the rise. In Holland, it's not just the Eastern Europe liberal democracies, it's even in the kind of Western European countries. I mean, I
Well,
think,
you can
MAGA,
win a.
Trump is nationalism. It's a kind of weird kind of national, but it's like, MAGA is a kind of attempt at nationalism. He said
I
it.
don't
Remember when
think that
Trump
they
said,
are generating anything like the same level of unity that people with that kind of language would have been able to generate in the 20s and 30s. Certainly, nationalism is still a force which has purchase. The concept of liberty still is a force that has purchase. I'm not saying that that these things don't have purchase. In fact, I'm saying all of them do. All of them do a little bit too much for any of them to prevail. There's an episode of The Simpsons where they tell Mr. Burns that he has every disease, and he's managed to stay alive because he has all the diseases at once. No one of the diseases can kill him because of all the others that he also has. And that his body is in this sense, a fragile ecosystem that could be disrupted. I wouldn't take the point that far. But I do think that there is a level of disagreement we've reached, which is unprecedented in history and makes it extremely difficult to do the things we used to do. I do think that this is the distinctive thing now. That's
So
not to say that,
where does that leave us in terms of political prospects? Because that kind of suggests that not anything can really change or happen, even on like the right. Because even if you think that fascism is
yeah,
possible, you would presuppose a unifying idea, like, right?
yeah, I don't think fascism is possible. And I'm not concerned about it, really radically not concerned about it, because I don't think it can happen in
In
these kinds
America
of
or everywhere?
places in embedded democracies. So this is
Even in
where I
Hungary?
think that, well, Hungary's not an embedded democracy. Hungary's only been a democracy since the 90s, right? Follow the Soviet Union. Hungary and the Eastern Bloc states are definitely not embedded democracies. I think there's a question about states that have been democracies continuously since the post-war era.
Italy?
You know, Italy maybe might be an embedded democracy. They still
I
have competitive multi-party elections, right? People may not
I
like
think that's because of the
Maloney.
I think that's only because of the EU. I frankly think the only reason that Italy hasn't, like, the reason why the prime minister, who has clear fascist sympathies, isn't more of an actual fascist in her governance is because she's a realist in terms of dealing with the EU. And the EU will sanction and cripple Italy like they did Greece if they were to do that.
I mean, it might be because of the EU. It might be because of Italian domestic politics. I am not someone who is reading Italian, so I'm not able to follow that political debate to the
Same.
level I would need to be able to follow it to make claims about it with, confidence. But this is, I think, where we could have an interesting debate. So if I can get you to think that it might be possible that this could happen in a state, right? A state could reach this point where it could achieve this deep pluralism. And then because it's achieved this deep pluralism, organizing and politics in that state would be changed by that fact, right? Then there's a question about what is the set of states to which this applies, and is the set growing across time? And I think that the set is growing across time, and that if these liberal democracies continue to be liberal democracies for long periods of time, they will become this way. And the consequence of their becoming this way is that it will become unthinkable to do a lot of different things, and that change will only be possible as a symptom of the malaise. And if you think about it, isn't this how we got out of the Middle Ages? It wasn't because in the Middle Ages, people were able to unite the three orders together. It was because the disagreement among the orders had a logic to it, which over the course of time fractured the church and the state in various ways, right? And the kings were able to appoint to use the disagreement to obtain an advantage and unify and centralize power around themselves, right? But it was in their competition with the nobles and the churches that they were moved to do that. It was because they were constrained that they worked with the emerging bourgeoisie, the townspeople, to empower themselves against those other two orders, right? So this competition for power and this struggle among different parts, which couldn't be unified together through some kind of unifying narrative, despite language and despite appeals to things like the common good,
Well,
it
all that
wasn't
suggests is that
possible.
the unifying narrative has to be in accordance and based in a reality, in the sense that a myth has to have real truth to it.
Yeah.
You can't just say anything that, like, and expect it to be real. But it's like with the bourgeoisie, I mean, like, you couldn't, revolutions barely happened at all before because everyone was just, in villages. You can't unite that way. But when you got the material conditions in which you had a bourgeoisie which is more economic and cultural power that could, gradually over time manifested in more political power, parliament, etc., then it can kind of, become more hegemonic. And socialist ideas only became prominent because the proletariat was organized in factories, and
Well,
now we don't have that anymore. Which I agree, which is why,
but
like, we're in a kind
but
of
then
weird
capitalism
situation.
broke it, right? Capitalism broke the unity of the bourgeoisie and introduced a new period of class conflict,
Mhm.
right? And so when it was just the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and then you have a Bonapartist state potentially trying to mediate, you have still a relatively simple schema. There is a contradiction, but it's relatively simple.
Mhm.
What if that contradiction becomes more deeply embedded and more complicated across time, such that the elite becomes partitioned against itself in various ways, and also the proletariat becomes partitioned against itself in various ways, such that you don't have two things mediated by a state, but you now have an ever increasing number of things, with a state also which comes to reflect this ever-increasing number of things. And so at this point, it becomes impossible for anyone to be able to grasp it, not just because complexity is stultifying, but also because there is actual complexity which is taken root. What if
But
you
it's
have a
stultifying
piece
in the
that's long
real
enough,
sense. Yeah.
a civil piece that's long enough to allow the complexity to reach that stage without it being cut short by violence, right? In other contexts, revolution, civil conflict, it cuts short the spilling out of disagreement. But if we don't have that, if we go 200 years with the same constitution, or if we want to say the American Civil War is a decisive break, 150 years with the same constitution, 100 years with the Westminster system with something approaching universal suffrage, right? Even if you want to be, you want to say, okay, because of universal suffrage or because of the Civil War, these aren't the same systems that existed 200 or 300 years ago. You don't want to date it to 1776 and 1688. You could date it to 1920. It's still 100 years. I think that what this allows is just very distinctive. And we just don't see this in other kinds of places where the time hasn't passed that's necessary to reach this. There is a function that conflict performs that if you don't have it perform that function, if you instead find ways to never allow the conflict to come to a head for a very, very long time, the only way that you can do that is to take the conflict up into yourself in such a way that you are now burdened by it. These embedded democracies are burdened by what has been.
Yeah, the state and the person. It's a very interesting. You could compare like way an individual internalizes conflict with the way the state does.
Yeah, they're burdened by what has been because they haven't had some kind of episode where they would purge themselves of the disagreements and reconfigure and rearrange. I do think it does make them different. Now, I think it's a fascinating question to ask which states are in the category. And I think that's where we could have a lot of fun. Like Italy is a very controversial question. Is Italy in the category? I'm not sure. I think Italy could be in the category, but I'm not sure that it is. For the reasons you suggest, the whole time Italy's been a democracy, it's been embedded in a set of American-dominated or EU-dominated structures, which might make it have an appearance of being more committed internally to democracy than it is, maybe. Hard to say. I would love to hear Italians argue about that. I want people debating this question of whether they're in an embedded democracy. I want to get us, having a discussion about, does this exist? Can it exist? And if it does, what does it mean? And then which states are in it? And the which states are in it question is, I do think there's a lot of room for disagreement. But I think if you've been in a democracy and you've pitched yourself as a democracy continuously for 100 years, it's very likely that you're in it. States that are post-World War II or post-Cold War, I'm much less sure about.
Struggling to see the logical, there is no logical conclusion, but what I mean is a sort of the thinking, which you're kind of spelling out for us, to me has accelerationist implications, good or bad.
Ooh.
In the sense that, like, okay, if what we're in is deep pluralism, there's no fundamental way to paper over the contradictions. And, there's a large, what I'm saying about the signifiers might kind of overshadow my agreement with you in a large part, in the sense that, like, I think Biden's presidency, and I wrote about this in the one chapter on the book on Trump, because I try not to talk too much about Trump. Biden was an attempt to kind of like, act like these contradictions that were playing out didn't exist or just kind of gone. When they say, let's get Biden in so we go back to normalcy. We restore the soul of America. They're appealing to all these myths to paper over the reality. And they always say Trump's problem is that he, made polarization so much worse. And it's like, did he, or did he just expose it? Did he just expose it? Did he just manifest the symptom? And I wonder, though, is like, taken to its conclusion with this sort of fracturing of the state, where it's like not only are the dominated classes so fractured to the point where we can't really viably define class, and the ruling dominant classes, like, I'm already struggling to define that. That's a thing I talked to. I have one video about this where I settle on dominated versus dominant classes, because as Nikos Palantzis' distinction, because it's really hard to define what the hell a working class is now, or what the hell is a ruling class. But there seems to be a lack of unity even among both the dominant or dominated, however you want to define them. I mean, with these contradictions that are existing, that are kind of crippling a state and making any unity formation impossible, does going through deep pluralism kind of entail not that we have any choice, but what I mean is the way in which this would resolve itself is intensifying those contradictions and seeing them play out, in which you alluded to a sort of a boiling point of a crisis, like, in the sense that you're talking about the transitions to new modes of regimes. I mean, what does that mean? Like, does that mean like civil war? Does that mean,
Well, I think if it could mean civil war, then you wouldn't be in this situation, right? A defining characteristic of this is that it doesn't produce that kind of thing. Now,
chronic
maybe
crisis?
I'm wrong. Maybe it will get bad enough that it will eventually reintroduce the possibility of that thing, or people will come up with some other new kind of regime that they'd like to see that will break through this embeddedness. And that, is at least in principle a possibility. But I think, to take it fully seriously, the idea, we would have to grapple with the possibility that the disagreement could go really far and it could really, really frustrate the capacity of the state to act and operate. And yet, nonetheless, people would not get revolutionary in response. And so then there's this question of, well, what would people do as the thing becomes more and more dysfunctional and they continue to be unable to imagine wholesale replacing it? What could we do? So there could be opportunities to organize in society that come out of the state's inability to manage various parts of the structure that it previously could manage. That could be one possibility. Another possibility is that the parts of the state could weaken each other in internal conflicts, such that new possibilities emerge for those looking to compete with that center of power, right? Another possibility is that, there could be questions emerging about the nation state as a unit, right? Nationalism works on the premise that the nation state can do things. Part of why the nation state is compelling in nationalism is that you think it represents you. So therefore, it has to have this relation of representation and this capacity to act on the basis of this. This is disabled in various ways now, right? The nation state can claim to represent you, but oftentimes it can't act on your behalf in international politics in any kind of meaningful way, except in this kind of superficial culture worry way, right? Like even a state like Hungary, the government is constantly posturing about how it represents a distinctive Hungarianness. And yet in practice, in terms of EU rules, it follows the EU rules economically. It remains committed to going along with the economic rules that have allowed it to develop and get rich. If the Europeans ever actually said, we're going to stop you from developing and getting rich unless you change in a credible way, the Hungarians would respond by doing what the Europeans want. It's because of the way in which Poland and Hungary have protected each other institutionally that Hungary's been able to get away with as much as it has. But, ultimately, a lot of these states are not willing to do things which transgress against the supranational economic rules, both those written and unwritten. And this very heavily constrains what the nation states can do in practice. And as soon as a government that is pushing nationalism does something which actually causes a disruption in terms of inflation, unemployment, like Liz Truss, the popularity of the government evaporates in the blink of an eye as soon as it actually starts to get real and starts to mean something material in people's lives. And this is what I think the people who think that we're just going to get nationalist are missing. The nationalists do not have an economic plan that is compatible with the way the world works. They don't have one. So when they're actually
totally,
in that
when you look at
situation,
Trump's plan, that's totally true. I mean, like, well, people at the Wall Street Journal are always writing about how Trump's plan is going to cripple the economy because of his high tariffs. And it's interesting because, I mean, like, I also fail to see how Trump's economic plan will really work. Like, what is like American manufacturing going to have a new renaissance? Like, how is it going to compete with Japanese and Chinese, or let alone Vietnamese manufacturing. It's kind of
Yeah.
like I don't,
Only by being heavily automated and therefore not
or just
generating
paying
any
people
jobs.
nothing. Yeah, or like paying people, like he would have to get rid of the minimum wage or something for America to
Yeah.
be competitive with those countries.
And in practice, Republicans in the Senate will threaten to take away his tariff power if he uses it to a point at which they think it poses a danger to their ability to get elected next cycle. So, that's what happened
Right.
last time.
And it's also because it's hard to imagine, because even if he imposes these tariffs, it would mean higher prices in order to actually stay profitable. And, there's only so much companies can actually have high prices while still being in business and still competing, like without collapsing. Because I mean, there's the rates of profit tendency, the rate to profit to decline. If they have to keep raising prices, I mean, how much can they even do that and still meet profits and that are expected of investors, and have people still like, which requires people buying their shit. Like, can
Yeah.
Americans
They
pay
could do
those?
a little
If
bit
they
of it though, right? Like what they'll
right.
do, and this is what they did last time, is they did a little bit of tariffing so that they could say they were doing tariffing, right? And then the
Mhm.
people who opposed the tariffing went, oh my God, it's a trade war. They bigged it up and acted like it was a huge thing. But then the actual change in terms of imports from China or trade volume was incredibly negligible. The United States traded more in 2020 during the pandemic than in 2016. And goods imports from China fell only, what, 6% during that period? A very, very small amount. And they increased by 88% in Vietnam. So this reshoring stuff, I mean, for one, mostly they just mean friendshoring. And then for two, they never actually do it enough to cause any kind of serious negative effect. But they do it enough to be seen to be doing it so that there is a discussion around them that is like, oh, it's disruptive, it's radical, he's transforming things. But the tariffs were so light, Biden didn't even feel the need to get rid of them. They really were not huge tariffs. And that's what they'll do. They'll do enough that people will complain and yell about it. And that will make it seem like a lot is happening. But then the actual economic situation, the underlying numbers will change very little. And this is how it goes increasingly with the right. The right talks this big game all the time, and then they don't do anything. Because if they actually did the things that they say that they would do, it would produce economic consequences they can't politically survive.
That aspect of the lack of change obfuscated by this political polarization, I have talked about in terms of when writing about the carnivalization of politics and hegemony through gridlock. But what I think you're really elucidating that is different, and I think adds to something I probably didn't incorporate enough, is this sort of fracturing of the elite itself, which makes the state incapacitated from possibly even fulfilling the goals of its investor class,
Yeah,
like
of itself.
of itself. Yeah. So like that's when we might see an acute crisis, if like the state can't even reproduce itself.
Yeah, if you get into a situation where it's not that people want to do anything different, but that they have been given no choice because the state is not doing the things it needs to do, then you can back people into doing things that they may only do reluctantly at first. And I think very often in politics, that's how change happens. People get backed into doing things that they don't want to do.
That's absolutely true. That makes a lot of sense, actually, because I mean, well, the New Deal is a perfect example of that. And so is electoral, like pretty much so is the embrace of democracy. I mean, is a result of that in many countries, like not only in the Nordic countries, but also in, England is the most obvious case of this. It's nothing but like, disgruntled elites reluctantly imposing electoral reform because they think it's necessary. It's like they can't avoid it. Tocqueville is one of my favorite thinkers to read, because Tocqueville is one of these very lucid kind of figures who's like between two worlds. He's an aristocrat who's writing a book that's often read as some sort of like praise of democracy. When I see it more as like a warning for French aristocrats. And he's pointing to like Americans he's pointing to America to say like, look how they managed to contain the inevitable. He recognized that the wave towards democratization is kind of going to be very hard to avoid. He thinks it's
Mm.
unavoidable. It's been unleashed. We have to do something to kind of contain it, because he has all these like, he basically like hates the most democratic things about democracy. He writes about tyranny of the majority, the taking away private property. He's opposed to he takes the kind of anti-socialist stance already when the debates are emerging in the social question. But he's like, let's recognize that this is a thing, but let's try to contain it before it gets too bad. In many ways, he is way more ahead than a lot of French people are in his time. I mean, France goes through all these different republics. But yeah, no, but the thing is like, what about thinking that through from someone who wants to change the system in a more democratic or socialist way, right? Because it's like the way I see Tocqueville is like someone who accepts change, but wants to keep aspects of the old order, namely, elements of aristocracy.
Right. There is this question of how do you back people into doing the things you want to see happen? And I think our assumption has been we organize and then we confront them with a strike in the streets, with a large mass movement. But there may be other ways of intervening in these conflicts that don't require doing things we can't actually do. If we are able to think about it for a while, I think the trouble is that because it's not easy, because there isn't something obvious that I can say, oh, this is what you'll do, right? Uh, because of this, people prefer to imagine that they can do other things that we know it from the 20th century have been done in other places, right? And it's easy to respond to the argument I make by pointing to things that have been done in the 20th century and go, well, why don't we try that? Because at least we've seen that it's been done. But I do think that we'll have to watch very closely these emerging conflicts, and it will be difficult to do. And the more of us that are watching, the more we can compare notes. And we might be able to spot opportunities and possibilities that we can't articulate at the beginning of that process if we watch closely and we compare notes. And so my invitation to people is to do theory with me, and let's observe this thing and observe the conflicts in it as they emerge and develop, and compare notes and talk to each other about what we think might be possible. But based on what we're seeing now, and not based on what people used to do in different contexts, which I think we can bracket as not like ours in various ways, right? And that's why the comparison that people like Levitsky and Zablat make to Venezuela is just so lazy and unhelpful. I mean, really, as a petrol state, a small petrol state, a weak state in Latin America, in a similar circumstance to an embedded democracy that's been around 100, 200 years, the most powerful state in the system, or one of the richer states where there's a enormous amount of consumption that's part of people's day-to-day lives. If people are accustomed in Venezuela to very high amounts of inflation, that's just something that happens sometimes in Venezuela. In this country, if you have 5% inflation, you can't maintain a government. You're out. You're viewed as having messed up. The expectations for the state are totally different in these democracies versus other places. Yeah, and yet these empiricists and comparativists, they make these very lazy analogies. And they go, oh, see, Chavez, he attacked the courts. Therefore, if Trump is talking the same way, it must have the same implications. And it's just do anything but look at what actually goes on in the United States. That's the attitude of a lot of social scientists and theorists right now. Do literally anything else except look at the actual United States as it exists today.
Yeah. We were talking about like going to the 20th century for hopes. It reminded me of in the Patreon Backroom segment that I did with Matt McManus after we talked about his book on the political theory to liberal socialism. I asked how he envisions like the road to socialism, and he gave an example of like a failed attempt and a successful attempt, and he gave the failed attempt at Allende in Chile, because it was defeated by coup d'état and all sort of obstacles even before that, and he brought up Olof Palme in Sweden as a success, as a successful socialist movement, because Olof Palme famously said Sweden came closer to socialism than any communist country did. Now, what I asked him right after he said that was, but what happened in Sweden happened under the pretext of a very developed labor movement, and also a highly ethnically homogenous country, which, we get uncomfortable talking about that. But let's be honest, one of the biggest ways in which the working class has been divided in America, this is just an absolute fact that has made it way harder to organize, is the fact that America is, much more racially segregated, in a very different way than it was back then than now, of course, I'm not sure. But back then, you had a slave population that, and then after that, a segregated black population where you could always point to the working class to be like, well, you could be worse. It was very easy to pit people against each other. That's why they never got that. And now even it's also, now you don't have the slave situation, but you have all these different ethnic groups. You also have a lot more immigrants who are willing to work for cheaper. How are you going to organize in a way that you can in a highly ethnically homogenous country with a very big labor culture? I brought that up, and it's like, he was kind of saying, well, we can just try to build the labor movement by, organizing the immigrants with the workers. And I'm thinking like, I'm all for that, but I feel like there's something that needs to be acknowledged about why those situations are markedly different.
The labor unions are never coming back. People who start with the labor unions are totally anachronistic. The labor unions are never coming back. You're never getting mass employment factories in the core states, in the rich countries ever again. That will never again happen. And the labor unions that exist in other sectors will never have the power to deprive capital of millions and millions of dollars by shutting down a factory for 30 minutes. It will never be comparable. And solidarity among different parts of the working class has been shattered by the separation into professionals and blue-collar workers and into state sector and private sector workers. So when a group goes on a strike, even say the Teamsters, people who work in logistics, railroad workers, right? What happens in Canada when the Teamsters go on strike? Does everybody else come out and help them? No. The government takes away their right to strike and then, threatens them with the police, and they stand down. Even the most powerful kinds of labor unions that still exist, which are mainly in logistics, trucking, railroads, they're not capable of being the base for socialism. And so anybody who is expecting to make a socialist movement based on the trade union movement or labor unions
Or a
is just
universal,
not.
or a revolutionary subject.
Yeah. But specifically on this point, because I do think, there's a lot of it in the DSA in the States, as people have despaired about the electeds. They've tried to imagine that they can go into the labor unions and radicalize them or expand them or something. And then they play up the significance of every new union that's created or every place that's unionized. You look at the percentage of the US population, US workforce that's in a union, it's been stuck at about 10%. And it's only gone down slightly over the last 10 years. It used to be 10 point something, and now it's about 10 point nothing. They're not even keeping up with the growth of the population. They're not even keeping up with the growth of the workforce, all of this stuff they say about unionization. And the fact of the matter is, we do not live in this early capitalist, mass factory setting. And we can't bring it back, and unions don't have the same functionality in other sectors. They can't do the same thing. They don't produce the same consciousness or the same kind of organization. And even the unions in Sweden at this point are heavily centralized structures where the ordinary worker has almost no say at all in what goes on. All the decisions are made in rooms where the leaders of the unions do deals with the government. It's all done at a very, very high level. And the ordinary Swedish workers are not at all involved in the day-to-day decision-making. They're just expected to trust the union bosses. Ultimately, it produced a kind of corporatism.
Yeah, that was in all the cases where all unions were, wasn't it? That's Robert Michel's argument.
Yeah, it produced a
Iron
kind
law
of
of oligarchy.
corporatism, which is extremely limited. Now, if you had managed to do socialism in the moment at which this kind of formation was widespread, then that would be an argument for it. I mean, if it had been the case that they'd popped off revolutions in all of these states, building off trade union consciousness, that had actually happened, then we'd be in a different world today. And that would have looked like it had been more plausible. And maybe if things had broken a little differently, maybe 100 years ago, maybe it was more plausible. But we certainly aren't getting those kinds of unions back. In the 1970s, 30% of the US workforce was unionized, and the labor unions got completely bulldozed by the neoliberals with their think tanks and their new NGOs that they funded and constructed over the course of 10 years. They multiplied their level of organization exponentially over the course of the 70s. If you look at the statistics for lobbying, for political donations, any of those stats, right? Within that period of time, they reached a level of organization which was sufficient to overcome resistance from the unions at the point at which the unions had the highest level of density in American history, right? These people, they could spend their entire lives union organizing. They'll never get the union density from 10% to 30. And at 30 in the 70s, when capital mobility was much more limited and there was still a second world system and the Cold War was still going on, 30% union density with large numbers of factories located in the United States, steel mills, car factories, big factories in the United States. That was insufficient to win the struggle of the 70s. So why do these people think they're going to get socialism by doing that today now? It doesn't make any sense at all. It's just because people don't want to wrestle with how difficult our situation is. They don't want to wrestle with it. So they'll convince themselves of anything so that they don't have to look at what's going on. Because when they look outside and they look at what's going on, it horrifies them. And it's horrible what's going on out there. It's terrible. But going into the books and reading about the 20th century and the 19th century, it doesn't help. I mean, it might help you think as an intellectual exercise, but then come back to where we are now, please.
This is going to be quite the black pill. And last time when I read your previous book and after a previous conversation, the labor movement, that's, I think, the biggest bitter pill. That's going to be hard to swallow because, I mean, how are you going to change this? Are you just going to tell people to just do it? It's like, maybe if enough people believe that, if change is predicated on everyone thinking what you want them to think, that's going to be pretty
Or even
damn
just
hard.
an unrealistically large number of people, right? Like even just an unrealistically large number of people or people from an unrealistically diverse array of situations within the economy. Yeah. The transmission mechanisms are broken too. Nobody trusts academics or theorists to tell them the way the world is anymore. Nobody trusts us. And why? Because so many of us were bought and paid for by the neoliberals in the 70s. We were. So why should we expect anybody to trust us?
A
Why
lot of
would
work.
they?
Let's be honest, a lot of leftist intellectuals are super out of touch, like talking about the proletariat and the working movement and, in a way that is divorced from like the common experience that people have. Like, it's like talking about organizing with workers. It's like someone who drives Ubers is going to not really resonate with that. They're going to be like, who am I going to organize with exactly? Right.
Mm.
Or it's like, if my job can be immediately done by a Filipino across for all the way in Philippines, why, how can I organize? What leverage do I have? It's not like I can shut things down. I mean, yeah, it's a pretty big bitter pill, but this is what leaves a lot of questions. And reason why I brought up elite theories, because, you talked about, kind of exploiting divisions in the ruling class and kind of this inevitability that, yes, a movement will need financing of some sort. And there's people who finance insurgent political movements for all sort of reasons that are not immediately short-term economic interests, or might be, but also might be due to another interest. I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of the conversation I'd like to expand, which in the back room, I want to discuss, a strategy you introduced in your last book and we talked about, which I think I noticed you're very reluctant to advocate. You kind of seem to think it's like something it's possible, but also has its problems. But, you're serious about it in a way that I haven't seen a lot of people even consider this as a possibility, which is the idea of running candidates in the two main parties, working within two different parties, kind of actually not being exclusive to one party, not being exclusive to one revolutionary subject, this kind of older thinking. And I think that's going to be the most controversial aspect of your argument. I want to explore that more in the back room, which will be the episode will be titled the right-left distinction, because I think immediately if you have an idea of working across party lines, you have to deal with the right-left distinction and the idea of like post-left or whatnot, because it is another uncomfortable conversation I think a lot of people don't want to discuss. But yeah, we've run up on time in the public segment. This has been very wonderful. And I'm very excited to get into this next little installment. It's always a pleasure hearing you here. And I hope people listening didn't get too depressed. If so, don't build your happiness on politics. Don't have politics what gives you your primary happiness in life.
Yeah, because
Yeah,
if you do, then you're dependent on maintaining a positive view of the world to be able to be happy, and that disables thinking.
exactly. Go make friends, and if you have the financial means, which not many people do in this economy, start a family. Anyways, we'll see you in the back room.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.